the San Francisco Ethics Commission. I'll call roll. Vice Chair Kopp.
Here.
Commissioner Rennie.
Here.
Commissioner Lee. Here. Commissioner Ambrose, I believe, is delayed, but I think she'll be coming and joining us shortly. Just as a housekeeping matter, unfortunately, I will have to leave today at 3:45 due to a conflicting appointment that I have at later in the afternoon, but I will turn the gavel over to my esteemed colleague, Vice Chair Kopp, and he will conduct the remainder of the meeting. So without further ado, I'll call agenda item number 2, public comment on matters appearing or not appearing on the agenda.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Is it on?
Yes, there
we go. My name is Lou Ann Basson, and I am a first-time candidate. I'm running for supervisor in District 4. So I've been dealing with the Ethics Commission and the Fair Political Practices Commission since June of this year. I was lucky enough to be able to become a candidate within the 5-day extension when Katie Tang decided not to run. During this time, I have been very grateful for the front office staff at the Ethics Commission, particularly Johnny Hosey. He has been invaluable in helping me with all of my questions. And believe me, I have had so many questions. And the way I would contact Johnny generally was through email, because it gives me a way of tracking my question, and I would often send a question in the middle of the night or very early in the morning. And as I said, I was very gratified that Johnny was so prompt in answering all of my questions, steering me in the right direction, tell me what page numbers to look on, etc. So I really want to commend Johnny and any other front office staff that I dealt with over the last few months. So I'm here today because I was just dismayed to see item 5 on your agenda, which purports to clarify, streamline, and make more transparent the processes for requesting and issuing informal advice. And I'm only going to speak to informal advice because I haven't actually requested any formal advice. So the proposal includes providing incredible amounts of information just to get a simple answer. And I think that item 5 is really, really not well thought out and is not going to be helpful to first-time candidates like me. In fact, it really appears to be designed to hinder, interfere, and be extremely burdensome on a candidate, whether first time or otherwise, but particularly for a first time with no prior experience. Is that my 3 minutes? No, okay.
No.
Oh, thank you, okay. So, for example, if I was to email Johnny now under this new regulation, I would have to provide my name, my title, my position, my email address, my mailing address, and my telephone number, and whether the requester is an authorized representative, et cetera, et cetera. And it just goes on, all the material facts, et cetera, et cetera. When I email Johnny and I ask him, Johnny, what's the deadline for electronic filing? Is it midnight or is it 5 p.m.? I don't need to put all of that extra information in. And for those of you who don't know, I'll just say again, my name is Lou Ann Basson, and I just won a writ of mandate from the Superior Court against the Ethics Commission and your executive director. So please take my comments under serious consideration, and remember that there are going to be other first-time candidates, and they need the help of people like Johnny. They don't need to be burdened with nitpicking regulations, which is what item 5 is. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Okay. Agenda item number 3, it's on the consent calendar, the draft minutes for the Ethics Commission September 21st, 2018 regular meeting.
Move approval.
Second.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. The motion carries unanimously to approve the minutes from the September 2018 meeting. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Any public comment on the minutes? No public comment. Okay. Agenda item number, 4, discussion and possible action on public financing review project, findings and recommendation.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm Pat Ford, Senior Policy Analyst. The report that you see before you attached as agenda item number 4 represents staff's efforts over the past 4 months to perform a comprehensive review of the public financing program. And for those who are not familiar with this program, this is the city's program to provide public funds to candidates who are running for mayor or board of supervisors in San Francisco if they demonstrate that they've met the program eligibility requirements, and that once they've qualified, they become eligible to receive funds pursuant to a particular funding formula. Back in June, I presented to you for about an hour talking about how this program works. And since then, I've been engaged with many different stakeholders, including candidates, treasurers, interested persons, staff in other jurisdictions that administer public financing programs, experts on public financing at nationally recognized nonprofit organizations, and lots of different folks who've wanted to provide comment. So this report is essentially a summary of what I heard and what I found by talking to all of these people, and it provides you with a list of my recommendations of how the program could immediately be made more effective. And that is structured essentially in what I'm calling a two-tiered approach. And what I'm recommending to you in this report is that you approach this in 2 tiers. Tier 1 being what I would call changes to the current system. And you can see that in section 2. Keeping the current system of public financing, what could you do to fairly quickly make it easier for candidates to qualify under the current requirements? When I say easier, I mean making it more streamlined for them to prove that they have, in fact, qualified. That would include a number of administrative changes on our end, which I don't detail too much in here, but glad to talk to you about that. Also, some changes to the regulations to make it clear to candidates and their treasurers how they demonstrate eligibility to our office. And I also do recommend some very targeted legislative changes through ordinance that would also be in the same vein of basically streamlining the program, making it easier for candidates to follow the rules under the current system. Section 3 then gives you kind of some broad strokes about what would a more in-depth and more actual changing of the program look like. So if you were to determine that you want to actually start to look at changing the rules of who can qualify to be in the program and what would they get, what kind of financing would they get once they do qualify. Section 3 gives you some ideas of things that I heard from interested persons about how that could be done, changing the financing formulas, changing the thresholds, changing the matching ratios, things like that. The reason that I decided to structure this in 2 tiers like this is because I think that there are certain changes you could make fairly quickly. I think that the changes I'm recommending in Section 2 generally are straightforward, and I think that they are the most responsive to what I heard from candidates, treasurers, and other interested persons. I sent out surveys to all candidates and treasurers who had applied for public financing, and I tried to send it also to those who hadn't to find out what their experiences had been. And I tried to tailor these recommendations to what their concerns were, ways that I think we could make the program equally as effective, equally keeping the same level of scrutiny to make sure that we're only awarding funds when warranted, but making it a little bit easier for them. Because we don't want to dissuade people from participating. Obviously, part of this program is being inclusive, and this is designed to help people be part of the program. So I think it may be best at this point if I turn it over to Chair Chu and the rest of the commission and answer any questions that you may have about the recommendations rather than rolling through all of them. Unless you would like me to, please let me know.
No, just from a process standpoint, Pat, could you refresh our recollection in terms of we started this in over the summer, and now this is your first report, and what, based on the previous policy prioritization plan that the Commission adopted in June, what are you contemplating for this body of work going forward, and what's the timeline?
Sure, yeah, great. So for context, back in June, the Commission approved a policy prioritization plan, which is the format that I recommended you use to reassess on a quarterly basis how you want to devote policies resources. Right now, there's one of me. Hopefully very soon there will be two in our division. But what policy priorities does the Commission want the policy division to focus on? In June, you decided that the top three priorities would be, in order, this project, reviewing and providing recommendations to potentially reform the public financing system. Number two, looking at the campaign finance reform ordinance regulations, bringing those into alignment with changes in CFRO, the campaign finance reform ordinance, making other changes that would clarify and correct some mistakes that actually exist in the regulations, et cetera. And then number three, researching and potentially providing recommendations about online political communications, where committees or other individuals are paying money to promote political messages through social media or email or other forms of online communication. So those were the top three: public finance, CFRO regs, online political communications. So this represents that first project, the public financing project. This is the first deliverable on that project, of basically showing what went on during the summer. So what was the process of review? We had two interested persons meetings, one on July 31st and one on August 1st, that were held over at 25 Van Ness, where our office is located. We had a lot of turnout at those meetings. I would say probably 10 to 12 people at each one. That include candidates, treasurers, just folks who are interested in the program generally, who weren't candidates or treasurers. And I include some of their feedback here. And then, as I previously mentioned, there were questionnaires that I sent out through email to people. I also got a lot of phone calls. People just wanted to talk about this. I also reached out, like I mentioned, to lots of different agencies, especially talked in depth with folks in Los Angeles, Seattle, and New York. They have programs that are very well established, that I think are highly regarded as being well administered. They appear to be quite efficient and effective, high rates of participation. So I talked a lot with folks there about how they approach issues like having candidates prove residency for their contributors, basically what is the format for candidates to electronically submit their qualifying requests, and just generally what are their practices. That's kind of more on the administrative side, just to see if there are ways that we could find more efficiencies that they've discovered. So this really is a way to try to encapsulate all of that. So rather than organizing it by all of those different experiences, I tried to fold them all together under these different topics, under the recommendations. So under each recommendation, I list basically what the finding is, something that I discovered through this process. So maybe I'll look at one in particular just to show you an example. So let me find one's a little bit shorter here. Sure, so if you look at page 9 on agenda item 4, so an example here, the individual expenditure ceiling. I give an explanation here about what it is. This is just kind of an overview, brief introduction about what is the independent expenditure ceiling. Then I give some findings. So a combination of data analysis, looking at the data that we generate and make available on DataSF, which is the city's open source data platform. So I analyze some of the data about individual expenditure ceilings, give some feedback that I heard from treasurers and candidates about it, and then move on to recommendations, where I say, based on these findings, based on what I discovered by reviewing the data, talking to people that have had experiences with the program, what are my recommendations about how you could change the individual expenditure ceiling in order to address these issues. So that's the general format of this. And I think that gives a little intro of how we reached this point. So moving forward, I have these recommendations here, so I do think that this is the proper course is at this time to adopt these recommendations, obviously subject to your discussion, and then to skip ahead a little bit. I don't want to take items out of order, but when we do get to agenda item 7, which is the policy prioritization plan, I am recommending that you maintain this public financing review as the #1 policy priority. The reason is I'm hoping that you will in fact adopt these recommendations, and then keeping the public financing review as the first priority will then allow me to do the work necessary to implement these. So a lot of these are regulations, so we'll need to draft them. We'll need to work with the city attorney's office to draft those regulations. They would need to come before you. You probably want to have interested persons meetings. You're familiar with the process with regulations. Likewise with ordinance. I am recommending some limited legislative changes. So a similar process would need to be directed on that front. So again, working with city's attorney's
on that process point, so your recommendations encompass both regulatory changes as well as legislative ones. For regulatory changes, well, you would draft both sets of changes, regulatory and legislative. But for regulatory ones, we would be hosting interested persons meetings to get feedback from the public as well. But it would, what is the process to get those approved, and what would be a timeline, and the differences between that and the legislative recommendations from a gating and approval standpoint?
Right. So actually, page 17 lays them out, which regulatory changes I've recommended and which legislative changes I've recommended, just so you can kind of see the different sets. And to your question, Chair Chu, the general process with regulations, the commission adopts them, and then they go to the Board of Supervisors, not for approval, but potentially the Board of Supervisors can object to them. They have 60 days to do so. If they take no action after 60 days, then the regulations are basically final at that point. So that's the process with regulations. So if you were to approve, let's just say, at your next meeting, a set of draft regulations, finally approve that from the commission, we would transmit that to the Board of Supervisors. Board of Supervisors have 60 days. If nothing happens at the end of the 60 days, they're done. With ordinance language, it's different. The commission by itself does not have the power to change CFRO. The commission is needed in order to change CFRO. 4/5 vote of the commission is needed, but it's not sufficient, meaning once you have approved by 4/5 majority ordinance language, then there's two possible routes. One is it goes to the Board of Supervisors, and as the legislative body, the Board of Supervisors could take that up, and they would need to vote by an 8/11 majority to approve that. And of course, before it would go to the full board, it would go to a committee, most likely Rules Committee. That body would have to recommend to the full board that they pass the legislative package. Then it would go to the full board, and like I said, 8/11. So I don't know if the last ordinance that we sent is a good indicator of how long it usually takes. The anti-corruption accountability ordinance took a while to go through that process. As you'll remember, we had a joint meeting back in April, and it took many months to have that legislation finally become operative. I would guess this one could go a lot faster just because it's so much more limited in scope, but just because we would be working with the Board of Supervisors, it's hard to say. It could take a while. Obviously, it would probably take longer than with regulations. I mentioned there are two routes. The
alternative would be to put it on the ballot, but the next regularly scheduled election is not until November of 2019.
Next year, 2019, right. So if that were the route that the commission took, assuming that the ballot measure were approved by the voters, I think the vote is usually finalized within about a month after the election occurring. So you're looking at probably early 2020 for those changes to become operative through the ballot route.
So thank you, Pat. I just wanted to thank you, for this yeoman's work out of your staff of you putting this together and engaging in the stakeholder reach out and soliciting feedback from multiple parties across. I think that is really informative and helpful to your analysis, and also gives me confidence that it's not just what the Ethics Commission staff thinks, but it's also incorporating the views and the input from those who are most immediately affected by the regulations and the experience that they have in the process. So I think that's really valuable. And I look forward to hearing from the public and the continuing dialogue with them. And so with that, would invite my fellow commissioners to ask some questions. My own initial sense is that I think that I would be in support of adopting the recommendations that you have put forward here. But I do want to give the full commission the opportunity to ask you questions and also to hear from the public.
Educate me a little bit. The purpose of this public financing, the idea was to sort of take money out of politics, right? So that
Try.
There'd be a limit, the candidate would limit the amount he or she would spend in their campaign. Is that right?
Originally, that was one of the stated purposes of the program, was to limit candidate spending. But it does seem odd at first blush to limit candidate spending by giving candidates more money. So I would push back a little bit on a narrow reading of that purpose. And I would say that in today's age, more appropriately, the purpose is to limit overall spending in elections. And part of the way to do that is to actually empower candidates. This program was created in the year 2000, and since then, independent expenditures have become a much bigger factor, even in local elections. Candidates oftentimes have a hard time getting their message out when you have a large volume of independent expenditures. So this program doesn't exist to try and level the playing field. That's not the point, but it does exist to try and give candidates a sufficient basis, monetary basis, to run a competitive campaign. The program seeks to identify candidates who have a certain level of grassroots support in the community. That's why there are the qualification requirements. Candidates have to demonstrate that they have received a certain amount of qualifying contributions from San Francisco residents. Once they've done that, the program essentially considers them to have that basis of community support, and then it provides them with what the framers of the program considered to be the level of monetary support that a candidate would need to run a competitive campaign.
What I don't understand is, in order to get public financing, the candidate has to say that he or she is prepared to keep his expenses within a certain limit.
That is
right?
correct. Yes, candidates have to
Now,
agree to the independent.
operates, so as I read what I see, is the candidate who's got a lot of money just keeps raising the amount of ceiling. There's no, in other words, it's meaningless, isn't it? I mean, if you're a leading candidate and you're raising a lot of money, you can raise your expenditures, and that raises the other people's level of expenditures. But
Correct.
there's no limit that says if there's no boundary that the candidate who says, I want public financing, has to live within. Is that right?
Yeah, I would agree with the core of that statement, yes. And the reason is that under the current program, the individual expenditure ceilings of publicly financed candidates is movable. The program has a mechanism by which staff must adjust upward the IECs, the individual expenditure ceilings of publicly financed candidates. And we have to do that based on a formula that I discuss in here that takes into account fundraising by an opponent, independent expenditures in favor of that opponent, and independent expenditures in opposition to the candidate in question. And you're absolutely correct that the experience with this feature of the program has been that IECs oftentimes get raised astronomically. I included a graph on page 10 of Agenda Item 4 that shows the IECs in a recent race, the mayoral race this summer. And you can see the IECs of the three publicly financed mayoral candidates. And in the paragraph immediately before that graph, I talk about how much those IECs of the candidates were raised. They were raised for one candidate to 147% of the initial IEC, for another candidate 229%, and for a third candidate 242%. So it more than doubled. And what's even more telling, I believe, is that if you look at the bottom of this page, page 10, the candidates, those three candidates were able to spend, each of them, above 98% of their funds, meaning that this restriction on candidate spending did not work. It did not restrict their spending. They were able to spend essentially all of the money that they raised because the limit kept going up.
So, Pat, you had previously mentioned Seattle and New York and LA. What is their experience in terms of having independent expenditure ceiling? Are their candidates also blowing through all of them and spending 99, 98+% of the funds that they have raised?
I would say by and large in other jurisdictions, yes, the answer is yes. But the other jurisdictions use a different model. They use the model that I am recommending we adopt, which is that instead of incrementally raising the IECs of the candidates, when it becomes time for the first raise to happen, that the IEC for that candidate be permanently lifted. The reason is that you can see what the effect is. The effect of our current system is no different. The candidates are, as soon as they're going to get one raise, they're going to get a lot of raises, usually. They're going to be able to spend all their money anyway. In the other jurisdictions, they find this to be the same case, that in a lot of times, in a lot of instances, candidates' IECs are permanently lifted because there are going to be a lot of independent expenditures. The IECs are going to be lifted, the candidates will spend money. You could ask perhaps whether or not that means the IECs are too low. The initial levels may be too low. Maybe they're not being adjusted with inflation. Perhaps they should be set higher so that they don't get broken as often. That could be a separate topic or separate reform, is to change the IEC levels. But the mechanism, I think, should also be changed independently because if candidates are effectively going to spend all their money anyway, there's no point in dragging them through the minutia of this feature of the program. I heard from a lot of candidates and treasurers that they have to devote a lot of time into constantly monitoring the changing IECs. Every candidate has their IEC evaluated separately. That's why it's the individual expenditure ceiling. So that means you've got a different level for each candidate. And for those of you who follow the press releases that are going to come out of our office, you'll know that right now we do this almost every day. We adjust the IECs of the candidates basically every day as we approach the election. And I think it's really dubious what the value is to keeping spending down when we adjust it. I think it would be much more efficient for the candidates and from an administration perspective for staff to use what is definitely the more universal model, which is to lift the IEC one time, one and done.
What press releases?
So our office releases a press
You mean the ones we get from the director?
Yes.
I think that's
All
right.
right,
I think they probably do come under Leanne's.
I didn't, okay.
The staff prepares those. The auditing division does the calculations. I draft the press release, and then the EDDA team puts that out on our website.
What, in these other jurisdictions, what's the penalty for exceeding the limit?
I'm not
If you
sure exactly
agreed
what their penalty is.
Agreed to public financing and to take public financing, you have to,
I don't
what do
know.
you do with the money in excess?
What do they do with the? I'm
In
sorry.
other words, the expenditures, once they bust the ceiling on expenditures that they promised to abide by, what's the implication or what happens?
Typically, it's a non-participating candidate's activity or activities of third-party committees that blows up the expenditure caps. Usually, it's not a publicly financed candidate spending in excess of their limit that breaks the limit for everyone. It's usually someone else. So what I mean to say is it's not the case that violations are causing the expenditure ceilings to be lifted in these other jurisdictions. It's lawful activity. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's not the case that there's rampant IEC violations in these other jurisdictions, to my knowledge.
In other words, you're saying that where the excess is coming from is from independent expenditure committees or third-party committees rather than the candidate committee.
Correct, or from a candidate who's not participating in the program. So
Oh,
you could have a candidate who is not participating and is spending very high levels.
Right.
And that would also then raise or permanently lift the IECs of the participating candidates.
Or it could
Regardless of.
be ineligibility in the future. which is what Supervisor Safai advocates, and that's discussed later in your report.
Yeah, violations would make them ineligible, right. All right. Commissioner Lee?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a follow-up question. For the jurisdictions who have removed the caps, have they seen the IECs increase or have they stabilized? You mentioned that several jurisdictions, LA, New York, and Seattle, they had removed the cap, so there was no limit.
No, they do have initial IECs, but they have the system
Then
where once it's broken,
right.
it's just permanently lifted in that race.
Right.
But they still start with a limit.
Right. So after they lifted that cap later on, have they seen the IECs stabilize or have they seen that spiked up?
Do you mean after they lift the limits, do they see an increase in spending,
More, right.
like independent expenditures? I don't know. I'm not sure. I would think not, because independent expenditures are not limited by the IEC. The IEC only applies to candidates participating in the program. It in no way restricts the expenditures of third-party committees. So I would not think that the presence or absence of an IEC for candidates would affect spending by independent groups. That would be my guess.
Okay. Pat, I have a question for you on pages 12 and 13 of your memo. You talk about the using candidate expenditures to calculate total supportive funds, and that would help make the calculation simpler and more comprehensible to candidates. And then on the very top, the first full paragraph of page 13, you talk about the primary drawback in that a candidate could have a large sum held in reserve, and then but hasn't spent those sums yet, but then will have that war chest for the last few weeks before Election Day. Do we have any data about when candidates spend money, just so we can see the curve of the distribution? Do they spend 80% of it by before the last 2 weeks, or do they spend 80% of it in the last week before the election? Just to give us a sense of what impact would that have if the ceilings are lifted, for example, and then there's a candidate, from a strategic standpoint, has only spent 20%, and then all of a sudden unleashes this barrage at the very end and could dominate the airwaves and the slate mailers and all those other things. What kind of an advantage would that give someone if we were to make that change?
To your first question, do we have the data? We have the raw data, yes. Candidates, just like any other committee that files a statement, they report all of their expenditures, and that includes the date of the expenditure. I have not performed an analysis of this data to the level of providing the kind of information that you're talking about. I definitely could. That is something we could figure out. We could make a graph similar to what you see on page 10, just showing candidate expenditures. And that might give you an idea of kind of where candidates do the bulk of their spending. And it could also give you an idea of what kind of lag could potentially be caused in the IEC raising. If I had to guess, I would say probably it's not tremendous, the potential lag. I think that candidates probably would make the expenditures, and we would be able to see it on their threshold reports, because those would stay the same. Candidates would still be doing threshold reports where they're disclosing in increments of 10,000 for supervisorial candidates, their activity, and 50,000 for mayoral candidates. So we'd still see it. But as I discussed here, we would have to see the activity and then adjust it. So there could be a 24 to 48 hour lag. I would guess if we were to plot candidate expenditures, we would not see more than 10% probably of their total committee spending occurring within any 24 or 48 hour period. That would surprise me. I would guess that probably the most they could cram into 24 or 48 hours would be like maybe 5%. I mean, candidates usually tend to spread it out a little bit more. They're usually pretty active during at least the last 4 weeks.
If that analysis is possible, at least at a high level, to give us a sense, because this would be a change that we would do, and that just understanding the flow of money, I think, over time before the election date, I think would be helpful to understand what impact, if any, a change in the regulation might have. It's especially, for example, in a mayoral race when we're talking about, between the candidates over $2 million each.
Yep, I'd be glad to provide that.
Thank you. Commissioner Kopp.
Okay. There's a lot of time and effort in this report, all of which Mr. Marsteller lead to reinforce my 40-year notion that public financing is unfair to taxpayers and doesn't do what it was cracked up to do, namely limit the amount of spending in the face of a U.S. Supreme Court case, which in 1974 held that a spending limit in a political campaign is unconstitutional, is violative of the First Amendment. And as I may have observed at a prior meeting last year, Dan Walters, the columnist who knows more about politics in the cities, counties, and state of California than any other human being, observed that no study has ever shown that public financing reduces campaign spending. I have a question first of a fact, which is what do we spend on public financing in an average election year? How many million?
I don't have that figure offhand.
Ms. Pelham probably has it, huh? I know.
Well, there's a cap. The fund is capped at $7.5 million.
What do we have in our budget for public financing?
Is it this one? Try again.
The fund was established by voters. It's a formula of $2.75 per resident in the city.
Yeah.
And each year, if the cap is not if the total amount of the fund is not at that $7 million maximum, the city is required through the general fund to put in funds to bring it up to that level.
Yeah, and what is it now?
It's about, in January 2nd, it was $7.034 million.
Yeah, $7 million plus dollars to get nothing but make campaign managers a little bit wealthier than they are. And only charter cities in California are allowed to do this because we stopped the unconstitutional action of the governor and legislature 2 years ago to let general law cities do it. All right. I'm prepared to accept most of these recommendations. I mean, it's a red tape system by nature, and anything which reduces the red tape should be enacted. Can we do so at this meeting?
No, you cannot finally approve these because we don't have language. What I'm asking is that you approve the concepts and allow me the time to prepare the language with the city
All right.
attorney.
Well, I would like you to prepare the regulations and the ordinance amendments which are required to implement your recommendations, with maybe a couple of exceptions. Commissioner Chu referred to page 13. I want to discuss that. Going to this expenditure method. Do you have any information on whether that has resulted in other jurisdictions which spend taxpayer funds on political campaigns as to the delaying of an expenditure so you can catch an opponent unaware in the last week or 10 days of a campaign?
I'm not aware of any specific instances of that happening.
Yeah.
I could definitely reach out to colleagues in those jurisdictions and ask them if they are.
I think you should do that because, again, I'm willing to accept your recommendation of changing to an expenditure method. And of course, human nature would dictate that Candidate 8 would wait till the last 4 or 5, 10 days to spend it. Then there's a discussion on page 15 of Mr. Safai's suggestion of ineligibility based on prior violations, which is a pretty good form of penalty. Have you had any communication in the last week or so after you formulated and reduced this to print
I have.
with his office?
Yes.
Okay. Is anybody from his office here? No. Okay.
No, I spoke with Catherine Meyer about attending, and she had a prior conflict and was not able to, but she said that she's very interested in continuing to work with us.
Well, I know she's interested because that's what her boss says. But what does she say about your comments?
She has not been able to provide substantive remarks about these
All right,
comments.
so we're on our own in terms of whether it should be for 5 years, whether it should apply to offices other than public elected offices of the city and county of San Francisco, and other subjects like that.
I don't want to speak for her, but I do believe that she plans to review these and provide answers.
Well, she better do it, because otherwise I've got to make a decision, and so do my colleagues, based upon what you have provided, and it's a clear description of what is at stake and what should be done. And if it isn't already clear, I want you to know that I think ineligibility is an appropriate penalty. And 5 years seems to be the norm, and 5 years would satisfy me rather than lifetime ineligibility. There's one other question I have. On page 7, under that regulation change which is discussed, what do you mean in the next to last paragraph, last line, staff would at least review the substance of the request? Amplify that if you would, Mr. Ford.
Right, so this is speaking to a current practice
Yeah.
of when a candidate has submitted a qualifying request, but has not yet submitted a statement of participation indicating that the candidate wants to participate in the public financing program. It has been staff's practice to review the substance of that qualifying request, meaning to review the list of contributions that the candidate provides and determine whether or not the candidate has provided 10,000 or 50,000, depending on which office they're running for, of qualifying contributions. Staff has reviewed for that in those circumstances. But even if they find that the threshold has been met, has not finally approved or recommended to the executive director that she finally approve it, because the candidate hasn't turned in the statement of participation, and you have to do that in order to qualify. I'm recommending that that practice be discontinued. Why? Because I think that that has given at least one candidate the false impression that that form is not outstanding. And that candidate later was ineligible for participation in the program because she had not turned in the statement of participation, even though her qualifying request
Okay.
under this practice had been reviewed.
All right, so this practice of evaluating the substance of the request would end. It sounds like a beneficial change. Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other, Commissioner Ambrose? You turn her.
That one.
Thank you. One quick question. Going back to public financing and the criteria that for satisfying the documentation for residency, you reference an address verification system. That's a new acronym for me. Can you tell me what that is?
Certainly. So the Address Verification System, or AVS for short, is an electronic system that credit card companies use to basically run a really quick fraud detection check. Basically what they do, so think of when you use your credit card online. You enter your name and you enter your billing address, and then you type in your credit card information and you click submit. What this system does is it checks the address that you just provided on that website where you're making a purchase against the address that you provided to your bank for that credit card or debit card, and it confirms that they match. It's intended to detect situations where someone has taken your card, your address isn't printed on your card, so in theory they don't know your address, and they're trying to fraudulently use your card without knowing your address. The system's supposed to flag it and deny the charge. That's the purpose of the AVS system. The way we use the AVS system is when a contributor goes on to, let's just say, ActBlue. That's a really common credit card processing system that a lot of committees are using right now. Goes on to ActBlue, goes on the candidate's page, types in their name, their billing address, and their credit card number. If that billing address is a San Francisco residence, and the AVS indicates that, yes, in fact, that is the address that the person gave their bank for the credit card, our office will consider that to be proof of residency in the city. In other words, if I go in and I type in 123 Geary, and then I make a contribution, and then let's say I'm an Ethics Commission auditor, I'm looking at it, I see Pat Ford, 123 Geary, this AVS will have a yes next to it, which means the system has checked, and that is the address that the contributor listed, 123 Geary. I check that on property records, I see it says San Francisco residence, that person is now a resident for purposes of the program.
And this information comes to you from AVS or ActBlue, or where do you get the report that shows that has been run through that system?
It's contained in the credit card vendor report. So this is something that committees, candidates, have to submit to our office when they are trying to demonstrate eligibility for the program. They have to show two things with each contribution, roughly. They have to show that, A, the contribution was made, so they have to show the instrument, be it a check or a vendor report from a credit card processing company showing that the credit card was run, and B, they have to show residency. So we see these vendor reports a lot where they're showing that they received a credit card contribution by including a vendor report that the credit card company sends directly to us. So we get those from ActBlue. The way that works is the candidate tells ActBlue to do it. They say to ActBlue, send the Ethics Commission a vendor report run from this day showing all of our contributions. So the auditors are able to verify its authenticity because it comes directly from the credit card company. That AVS information is included on that vendor report. So that's part of why we accept it, because it has that indicator of authenticity. For instance, it comes from the company.
Okay, great. Thank you for my education. I'm not sure anybody else didn't already know that. And then the other thing, though, I want to talk about is your recommendation for on appeals. And I understand why you want to add a standard of review that's more clearly articulated that would guide the commission in carrying out the charter requirement that we provide an appeal hearing. I'm not certain, though, that that is the appropriate standard of review. I had, very early in my career, the privilege of representing the Planning Commission, and a lot of times there are important public interests in what that commission would do, and people would have the opportunity to go to court and file a petition for a writ to have the decision of the commission reviewed. And it was very important to have the appeal hearing at the Board of Permit Appeals to further flush out the disagreement if it was that contentious or confusing or ambiguous an issue. And I recognize that for legislation, an arbitrary and capricious standard would be appropriate, but I think we should follow up with the city attorney's office and understand better if we have an appeal or we don't have an appeal, somebody still has the right to go to court and seek judicial review. I would like the commission standard of review to be the same as the court standard of review. And I would also like to give the public the opportunity to come forward and say, not just that someone was arbitrary and capricious, but just simply, they made a mistake. Here's the evidence. That was a oversight on the part of the staff, and now fix it and let's move on. So I want you to check into that before you bring back the regulations. And I also think we need to talk further about not granting appeals when somebody hasn't timely filed in light of the decision that came down last week. Because, again, if we can correct something at the administrative level and save the city from a legal action and save the courts from hearing things that we could resolve here at the commission, as long as you know, I'm willing to provide that if we can move things through more quickly and give people more opportunity to participate at the local government level before we get to court. So I'd like to look at that as well. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Okay. Call for public comment.
Hi, my name is Lou Ann Basson again. And Mr. Ford, I found your presentation extremely interesting. I only wish that I had been invited to participate in the meetings, because I would have had a lot to say about the process. I will just give you a few examples, but first, I want to remind the Ethics Commission, and not the commissioners sitting up there, but the lower level Ethics Commission, that they are public servants here to help the public, and that includes every citizen of San Francisco. And in regard to that, I would like to remind them that under the Campaign and Governmental Conduct Code, Section 1.100, their purpose is to enable candidates, and especially first-time candidates like me, to help me to run a campaign against an incumbent. Now, District 4 doesn't technically have an incumbent, but Jessica Ho might as well be, because she's Katie Tang's legislative assistant. Katie Tang is the current sitting supervisor. And she's Katie Tang's shadow. So she's functioning as an incumbent. And there are 7 other challengers in that race, including me. And I was really looking forward to having the assistance of the Ethics Commission in my campaign. And as I indicated earlier, front office staff, especially Johnny Hosey, was very helpful to me. Unfortunately, I cannot say that about his boss. So I want to remind the Ethics Commission that they need to follow their policies to ensure that all individuals and interest groups have a fair opportunity to participate in the elective and governmental processes, to reduce the advantage of incumbents, and to encourage competition in elective office. And that means me. Now, I will turn to some of the things that I experienced with the Ethics Commission. I was challenged because I entered accounting as occupation. I was told that was not right. It had to be accountant. Well, an accountant is a person. And the Ethics Commission's own form, the contributor card, says type of business. A type of business is not a human. Accounting was correct. I was made to change it. What nitpicking I had to go through. Another example, a doctor friend of mine contributed $500, very generous. He works for the federal government, the Department of Veterans Affairs. Have you heard of it? They have a big medical center on Clement Street. I was told Department of Veterans Affairs was not recognized as an employer. I had to go on the federal government website and copy out a long title, which barely fit on their chart page. This is ridiculous. Everybody's heard of the Department of Veterans Affairs. It's a federal agency, but the Ethics Commission refused to acknowledge it. These are examples of what I had to go through. This is ridiculous. This is such a waste of my time. This is what resulted in me filing a writ. And Mr. Ford, you have a standard of arbitrary and capricious proposed. Let me tell you, it was easy for me to prove that to the judge, what I went through, particularly with your executive director, because the judge ordered, he granted my writ of mandate, and he ordered Ms. Pelham, your executive director, to perform her ministerial duties, to review my documents, and to make a final determination. Because she refused to make a final determination, she denied me the opportunity to file an actual court case and appeal in Superior Court by giving me only a courtesy notice and clearly stating this is not a final determination. She tried to tie my hands. So I had only one recourse, and that was to go directly to Superior Court and the appellate court and file a writ of mandate, which the judge granted. And my documents were reviewed 7 weeks later. This has prejudiced my campaign. I expect my check for $10,000 by today, Ms. Pelham. I have waited long enough for my campaign financing. I'm sorry?
Wait a moment.
You've exceeded your public comment time.
And I'm moving an additional 3 minutes for you.
Thank you. I sincerely appreciate that, Judge Kopp. So I have to agree with you, Judge Kopp, on your comments regarding how this system violates taxpayers. It's an obscene waste of money. It is also, in my mind, a version of compelled speech, and I think it violates my First Amendment rights. I don't want my tax money being given to, frankly, my opponents. My tax money is being used by my opponents in this race to fight me. I don't want to support these candidates. If I do, I will write a check and make a contribution. But this is violating my taxpayers' rights. And I think, personally, the whole system should be abolished. And whether I become supervisor or not, I just might make this the life mission for the rest of my life, because I have been so wronged by this entire system. Now, let me move on to Ms. Ambrose's question about AVS, fascinating subject, absolutely arcane address verification system. In all innocence, my friend made me a website, and she decided to use PayPal to accept the monetary contributions electronically. On August 29th, I had a meeting with an auditor named Manisha, who told me, I have never heard of a candidate using PayPal. I was floored. What do you mean, you know, PayPal? Everybody uses PayPal. She said, we don't accept it. Well, guess what? The State Fair Political Practices Commission does. So why is that? Why doesn't San Francisco accept it? We had a half-hour conversation on the phone with somebody from PayPal, and he told us that they do contact the banks when somebody makes a credit card purchase. He said, the banks don't care about the address. Sometimes they acknowledge the verification's correct, and sometimes they don't. He said because the bottom line is all they want is their money. Manisha told me, but we can't be certain that somebody wasn't holding a gun to their head and making them type in their credit card information. I said, are you crazy? How could you? Maybe somebody was holding a gun to someone writing a check. This is crazy. So my final comment is, my experience dealing with the Ethics Commission and what Ms. Pelham did to me personally gives a new meaning to Kafka, to the definition of Kafkaesque. And Mr. Ford, I really look forward to working with you on these issues. And Commissioner Keene, I'm aware that you have some revisions pending, and I look forward to working with you on this because I have a lot to say, and I have documented everything that has happened to me. Most of it's already been included in the exhibits to the writs. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. I see a few new ones here. I just want to give tribute to my idol, Commissioner, Senator, former supervisor, a warder of what's the rights for us. But I'm here today to speak on ACE, on the case. And I hear y'all talking about this, and I hear it in a way, but this has something to do with somebody I stood toe-to-toe about the Alioto thing, but I can't say that. Ooh, y'all in trouble if she's after y'all. She's a queen at suing the city and the county by the bay. Anyway, I'm not here to say that, but obviously that's what y'all are talking about. May I get a copy of that, what you put, that everybody else have, that you read? It's over there? Well, I must have it. Okay, so let me go on. My reason today is to find out what's going on. I ain't been here for a while since the campaign when I was here standing toe-to-toe with Alioto, but in the paper I read that she's after y'all. All right, anyway, let me just go on. Thank you, sir. What I'm here is to say is, number one, I'm here because these are the two agencies that I have to get at all these city departments. It's the Ethics Commission and the Sunshine. You guys are the act right commissions of the City Hall. Y'all put everybody else on point. So I'm going to come back at another date because I didn't know y'all was going through this, and I'm going to be visiting y'all pretty regularly because I'm going to need your help. I'm back at City Hall in the press room, and already I'm experienced discrimination. I'm the only black in the print room. I've been gone for 10 years. They kicked me out, and now I'm back, and I can't even hold papers in the desk there. So I want y'all to investigate. It goes way back to Willie Brown, Silly Willie. Is that the media, the Chronicle, the Examiner, it was KCBS, now it's the Asian, they have private rooms. They have a key to get in, then they have private rooms. Did y'all know that? How much money has the city lost when the press room lists the Chronicle and the Examiner and all those people in that place? But when a black man come there, I got to go through all this and that. I feel like a secondary citizen. When I get in there, everybody look at me, next thing you know, boom, 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 doors closed. But now I'm back in there. I left some of my papers in the office. They arbitrarily came and took they call it stuff. Those are documents. Okay? On the same day, I interviewed the mayor, London Breed. We come from the same community, and we happen to be the same doggone color. She's a little lighter and look a little better. But I'm here to say I want an investigation on a couple of these departments, OCII, OEWD, Department of Real Estate, the city attorney, the sheriff department. And all these departments, I'll come back later. Only got a little time. But I'm telling you, put it on your mind. My name is Ace. And I'm on this case. And I'm coming back for your help because I'm going to need it. All these roguish department heads, they don't know what they do. They don't know SMS. Y'all know what that means, right? I can't say it publicly, SMS. Figure it out.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Charlie Marsteller for the record. I'll try to be clear, and I only have 3 minutes to explain public financing, but let me proceed. It's unconstitutional for us to level the playing field with PF, public financing. It is a platform to essentially provide a platform for debate. And another wrinkle that I have seen, which I think in this town is important, is as a check and balance on the political system and on political corruption. And I can't get into details, but there obviously are issues. For instance, are we building a safe city with tilting towers? There are people in this town that know the answer to that question, and should they decide to run, they may be running as a structural engineer and not as a politician, and they don't know how to run a campaign, or they don't know how to raise money. PF provides the mechanism for someone to come up and blow that whistle. So that would be an example of why it could be a very important check and balance on political corruption. And there have been instances in our past where that almost has happened. I also think that as the spending limit is raised, the press is very vigilant about who's breaking the limit. So they look at the Independent Expenditure Committee. They look at the big money person that's been trying to dominate the political scene. Being an international city, we have unfortunately been blessed also with valuable land. We have a dual problem, and that is there's a lot of capital and a lot of capital investor money attracted to this city that most cities may not have, and international money at that, some of which could be corrupt. So I think having to lift the cap continuously is not necessarily a bad thing. And I want to say one last thing, and that is Alan Jacobs, who was the director of planning, put together the urban design plan. And I called him and I asked him, what's the problem with the urban design plan? It's being violated with conditional uses from A to Z. In fact, that's the way we do business with conditional use, which is in other cities called special exceptions, which means entitlements given to people with money. I'll finish by saying Alan said that if we got rid of conditional use or limited it, we could also limit the problems we have with lifting the cap on public financing, because we would not have so much independent expenditure activity in this city. And if you think about it, that makes sense.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm very new to you all. But I have heard your story in the Chinese newspaper when Ellen Lee Zhao was running her campaign. She was in this room all the time, every single month. And she brought up to a very interesting case where she brought along her 5 co-workers together, and they went to the Ethnic Commission and filed for complaint. Guess what? The whole files are completely missing. That alerted me. That's why I'm here today, and I'm learning the whole thing. I'm glad that Ethics Commission is the last shield guard to hold the city accountable, and I hope that this is how the function of the Ethics Commission. I'm learning it today. My name is Wendy Wong. I'm from San Francisco Coalition for Good Neighborhoods. The reason we formed this coalition because we are fed up, we are pissed off of what is going on in the city. When Luann Basson is running her campaign, I know how painful that is she went through, because I was one of the campaign person volunteer for Ellen Lee Zhao. Ms. Basson has no campaign manager. She has no secretary. She has no bookkeeper. But the Ethnic Commission is setting those rules that's supposed to be anti-corruption, that should not have any big corporation to donate money to the candidate. But that is good intention and bad result. It hurts the first campaign candidate, just like Luann Bazin and Ellen Lee Zhao. We're talking about conflict of interest. We see a lot of big money coming out somewhere, big super PAC that is running the city. We don't have the grassroots candidate who is speaking out for the neighbors. I'm from Sunset. When I went to the Board of Supervisors meeting, we don't want cannabis in Sunset District. The supervisors know. The city, the whole city have to share the burden of the cannabis industry. Proposition 64 doesn't allow the industry going into a neighbor where they don't want them to be there. So I want to alert that the Board of Supervisors, even the mayor, has received the money from the industry that they vote. And I want to know whether this is a code of conduct, conflict of interest, because they received the money, they saw their lobbyists, but they refused to see the community. That's why I'm here today. I am not even interested in running politics. I'm just a normal person, but I'm here to make sure that the city is well run by decent people, but not big corporation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Commissioners. Elena Schmidt. Just a couple of quick comments. I want to make sure that you had a chance to read Larry Bush's submittal, and I want to highlight one particular part that he talked about, which is making sure that there is an opportunity for those who do not wish to have their street address made public, that you would accept something other than a street address. This is important in terms of domestic abuse places and that kind of thing where people are under threat and they want to contribute to a candidate, but they don't want their public for an address to be out there. At one point, I worked with the California Public Utilities Commission, and we had the same issue come up with telephone ID, and I know that they worked around it. I'm sorry to say I don't know what the answer was, but I know that sometimes when people ask for public addresses, there is a way to move around it. Make sure that we keep Larry's comments in mind as you move forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
May I comment, Madam?
Yes, Commissioner.
Sure. On that point, Ms. Schmidt, Mr. Bush makes the comment in a email dated October 17, 2018. One model is the state system that retains the address of some individuals in a confidential file to thwart those who would harass them. Options include having a recognized third party sign a sworn affidavit that the person is a San Francisco resident. And that's what you're referring to.
That's correct, yes.
Okay. Then I would ask the staff to investigate, consider, and have that part of the report next month.
Mr. Ford, before you do that, could you clarify what the current practice is at the commission with regard to the addresses of donors who contribute to candidates, and how that information is kept, and whether or not it in fact is made public?
Definitely. So right now, when contributors provide their home address for purposes of demonstrating that they're residents, the candidates provide that on a qualifying request or a matching request. But when that is posted to our website, the addresses are redacted. Just as we do with 460s, with campaign statements, the street number and the street are both redacted. So it only shows city, state, and zip. So that's already our practice. I think there was concern about At a previous meeting, when there was an appeal, both the candidate and staff attached full unredacted qualifying requests, and I think that's a practice that we can easily not do. We can just attach the public-facing redacted qualifying request if it's necessary to agendize an appeal and attach that. But our current practice right now, just for posting, is to redact them.
Okay.
Is
Thank you.
that true also of contributors?
Yes, exactly.
Thank you. Any other public comment? Okay, there being none. So for agenda item number 4 on the public financing review, Mr. Ford has provided 7 regulatory recommendations and 4 legislative recommendations, and I'd like to make a motion to approve those and direct staff to go forward and draft the regulations and the ordinance as stated on page 17 here.
Before you call for a vote, I request, beside the point just made about somehow protecting residential addresses as appropriate, a couple other suggestions from Mr. Bush. And that is his second one, which is to provide publicly a current list of people who are prohibited from making contributions to candidates. And thirdly, that the announced press releases of increased ceilings for candidates include the source of such funding, which causes the increase, particularly for independent expenditure committees. And I would ask for that, and I'm prepared to vote for the motion.
So I would, so just to recapitulate, it would be include a list of those who are prohibited from making contributions to candidates, as well as identifying the sources of funding when ceilings are increased. Okay. I would like to get the staff's view on that, on those recommendations.
Definitely. So on the first one with addresses, we do redact them, so I'm not sure what additional measures we could take short of we could cease posting them online. That's actually the practice in other jurisdictions. I spoke with Los Angeles this morning. They do not post qualifying requests online. They make them available, of course, through public records requests. That's a practice we could adopt. We could no longer immediately post them when we receive them. Right now, those forms, which are called the 1.152A, are posted immediately and automatically by NetFile when the committees file them, as is the case with 460s or 496s or anything else. It just posts. We could discontinue that. So we could make qualifying requests solely an internal document such that no one would even see the contributors' names unless they made a public records request.
I think that, I don't know that I would be comfortable going that far because I like the transparency of providing the qualifying request. But as I understand it, like currently, personal addresses of contributors are not made available on our website in any form, and that I would then request that to the extent that there is ever an appeal and that the attachment for the qualifying request is going to be made public as an attachment on an agenda item, that those addresses be redacted. consistent with the practice that we follow on the website.
I think we will definitely do that in the
So
future.
I don't know if that needs to be incorporated into a regulation or if it's something that we can simply implement
I think we could probably just implement
straight away.
that.
Okay,
Yep.
thank you.
So to the second item about making a list of prohibited contributors, I would say that we already do. We have lots of materials that assist committees, candidate committees, and others to understand what rules apply to them. And I would say that if there are ways that we are not making this clear enough, that we can do that. I don't know if there's a way to necessarily roll this into public financing. I think the main thrust of this project is to not overload the public financing program with a lot of moving parts. My effort here is really based on simplifying it. So I think in terms of educating candidates about who they may not take contributions from, I think probably working on just improving the existing resources is probably the best thing, rather than creating a new resource. What I'm referring to are the guides. So we have the guide for candidates, and we have the supplemental guide for candidates that are applying for public financing. Those guides already talk about these rules. I think that reviewing and revising them are definitely already on the agenda as one of the, and I don't mean this agenda, but the general agenda for this project, for helping our outreach to candidates. We're already going to go through and revamp that. We're going to have to, especially if you do indeed adopt these reforms. We're going to have to change the manuals. So I think going through and reforming those manuals to provide more information, maybe in a clearer way, about who the prohibited contributors are, I think we can absolutely do that.
May I
Yeah.
interrupt, Madam Chairman?
Commissioner Kopp.
Mr. Bush asserts that Friends of Ethics provided, past tense, its own list. Are you familiar with that?
I'm familiar with the public comment that Mr. Bush.
Huh?
Yes, I read it. Yes,
But you've seen that list?
I have.
Okay. Is that feasible for us?
So we already have that
All right,
information
you
in our
think
guide.
that's satisfied now?
Absolutely, and I think we can
All
work
right,
on making
well,
it even
if
better.
Mr. Bush is watching, I invite him to comment on that assertion. Thank you.
So on the third idea of including the sources of funding on the press releases about the independent expenditure ceilings, similar answer. We already provide a lot of information about sources of funding. I don't think doing it in two places is the best approach. I think if we are not doing a good enough job right now about informing the public about where campaign committees are getting their money, that's the issue. It's not that the press release should include it. It's that the data dashboard should do a better job. I'm not saying it doesn't do a good job. I actually think that the data dashboard is pretty fantastic and is probably in the top 5th percentile nationally of how ethics commissions are presenting data. And I think that it's constantly evolving. And if there are comments in the public about specific ways that the data dashboard or the statement search function on our website can be improved, we are all ears.
Is our current, I know that we embed links in the press release to the SF Ethics website.
Yes.
And this, perhaps in this, in the press releases that do announce the increase in the IECs, we could embed a more detailed link that would link the public or the reader to a particular candidate's webpage.
I think that's a great idea, and I am going to.
Because it would be, I think it would be exhaustive to include all that information, and that if it's a redirect to the actual website, it'll have real-time information.
Yep.
And all of its detail.
I will do that. Yeah, I will make sure that a link to the data dashboard is included in future IEC press releases.
So it sounds like then that the address, I mean, are you satisfied, Commissioner Kopp, that the address question, the concern that was raised by Mr. Bush has been addressed by staff because it's not currently included in any of the public postings for qualifying requests, and that on a go-forward basis, when qualifying requests are included in appeals that are heard by the commission, all of those addresses will consistent with that practice, also be redacted.
Okay.
Okay.
I think a motion is on the floor.
Well, there's a
Commissioner-
motion and a second, so it's pending.
So Commissioner Ambrose?
Not to belabor the point about the anonymity of someone who's feels vulnerable having their address out there, I think that what Mr. Bush was saying is that if you had a third party provide an affidavit that that person was indeed a resident of the city, then that person wouldn't have to disclose their address to anyone. And so I don't know if the district attorney's office, who more frequently deals with protective orders, if we could just look at that, because I think that might have been what that seventh category of documentation that you were proposing that we eliminate was intended to address, is the idea that a non-interested third party could confirm that the contributor lives in San Francisco without actually disclosing the address. And so I think, I mean, if there is someone from the DA's office who maybe could give us a clue how they handle that. I mean, I realize that it's obviously a very rare circumstance, but they're trusting that somebody in our office is going to sit there with a black marker and cross that out before it gets out. And as we know, everybody's address came out on the web when it came up in the appeal, and we don't intend to do that again, but I think there are vulnerable people, and we should try and respect their right to participate and protect their privacy. And then I do tried to make the point that on the appeals, I want to see further development and analysis of the appropriate way to proceed. I totally understand that we don't want to sit here with people coming forward and asking us to waive very clear code requirements with deadlines where we really don't have the authority necessarily to change what the legislation is. But at the same time, I think that needs to be developed. And so when you bring it back, I'm hoping we'll see that. And with that, I would support your motion.
Okay. All right, so we have a motion pending. All in favor? Aye.
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 Okay, the motion carries unanimously. Okay. Agenda item number 5. Continued discussion and possible action on proposed Ethics Commission opinion and advice regulations.
Thank you, Commissioners. Agenda item 5 contains a proposed draft of regulations that would apply to the Commission's opinion and staff's informal advice provision authorities. This is the third time this item has been in front of you. The first time it was in front of you is for informational purposes and to give you an opportunity to become familiar with them. You provided feedback during that initial look at these regulations. That feedback was incorporated into a new draft that came in front of you at the last meeting. And I was absent at the last meeting, as you know, and Executive Director Pelham and Mr. Pierce, Mr. Shen, together tried to answer your questions about these, but you communicated that you wanted to wait until this meeting to have some final questions addressed. So my goal today is to address those questions. I've had a chance to review the film of last month's meeting, and I've communicated with a few of you in the interim, and would like to cue these up with a little bit of an intro, try to answer some of the questions, and then make myself available for more questions that you might have about these. So first of all, as I mentioned, these regulations would create processes for the Commission's opinion process and for staff giving informal advice. These two features are created in the Charter. The Charter says that the Commission may provide opinions and staff may provide informal advice to people who are asking about their duties under the law, which includes the Charter, code, regulations that pertain to campaign finance, conflict of interest, lobbying, and other subject matters that this commission has jurisdiction over. And that is the fundamental thing that makes a question informal advice or opinion, is when somebody is asking, how does the law apply to me? How do my facts play out under the law? Please tell me. That's exactly the same for opinions and for informal advice. The only difference is the person asking staff or is the person asking the commission. If they're just asking staff, then it's informal advice. It does not matter how the person is asking. They could ask through an email. They could ask over the phone. They could come into the office. They could send a telegram. It doesn't matter. The medium is irrelevant. It only matters if they're asking about their own duties under the law. If they take the additional step of asking the commission to issue an opinion, obviously that makes it an opinion. And really the only difference is that the person adds on to the question, I would like to hereby request an opinion of the commission. So that's a quick look at what is an opinion, what is an advice. If a question does not fall into either of those categories, meaning if a person is not asking about their own duties under the law, if they're just asking a question, let's say, what's the meaning of Code Section 1.126, or when are 460s available? They're not asking about their own duties under the law, so it's not informal advice, obviously not a request for an opinion. What is it? I would call this a general inquiry. It's just a question, and I can tell you that we get these every day, and we endeavor to answer as many of them as we possibly can. And I think we answer about 99% of them.
So, for example, one of our comments earlier from candidate Busan was about, I called up to find out when is the deadline, is it 5 p.m. or midnight? So that question under these regulations would still be answered.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, that's an example of informal advice, because you have a candidate calling and asking, what do I have to do? How does the law apply to me? Even though it might not seem like someone asking about how does the law apply to my facts, because they're asking a simple question. They are, right? I mean, the law requires candidates to file certain things at certain times. So when they ask about how to finish those filings, how to submit them when they're due, it is informal advice. Let's say that someone wasn't asking for themselves, they're just curious. Let's say someone just called up and said, out of curiosity, when do candidates have to file that form? We're not going to decline to answer the question. That is not the point of these regulations, and it's obviously not the purpose of having a staff answering phones.
And so then that question, for example, would not have to be written in an email with laying out all the different information that is specified in the regulation. If it's a question like, when is the deadline to file, or what date is the 460 needing to be filed?
No. General inquiries, meaning someone not asking about their own duties under the law, would be completely outside of these regulations, not addressed. And I can tell you what our approach is to those now and would continue into the future, and that's to endeavor to answer as many of them as we practically can. That is going to be limited by having to balance that interest in responsiveness with a prudent use of our time and of the commission's interpretive faculties, meaning if someone calls up asking a novel question that would be an issue of first impression, if you've never encountered it before, and that person's not actually asking because it applies to them, they just want to know the answer, we would probably decline to answer that question. We would wait until it actually comes before us. You can think of it as like the actual case or controversy requirement. Courts don't hear things until it actually is at issue in a case or controversy. It's a similar idea. We would probably decline to do the high degree of research, collaboration with the city attorney's office, other departments, consulting the commission, unless that actually were a request for informal advice. If it's informal advice, absolutely yes. The answer is yes, we would do it. But that's in part what this is to do, to help people see what is the difference between these two charter processes of opinions and advice, and then what is this, other stuff of general inquiries. It is not to try and exclude people from asking general inquiries. We absolutely still encourage people to do that, and in the vast majority of instances, it'll be really easy to answer their questions, because most general inquiries are very simple. People want to know, how do I access information on your website? Where's your meeting? How many commissioners are there? Really, there's a lot of basic questions. How do I perform research using the data dashboard? Those are all general inquiries, and I can tell you that we will continue to answer them, because that promotes the commission's mission, and we're not going to stop doing that. So the purpose of this, aside from making that distinction, helping people know what defines these two very specific processes under the charter, the other thing is to give people an actual understanding of what they have to do. if they want to get informal advice or an opinion. Right now, the charter gives us no information. It basically just says people can ask for opinions and they can ask for advice. But the code and the regulations give no further clarity about how do you ask, what form, what information do you include, how much time does staff have to respond, when does the commission have to hear it? It's silent. And I can tell you that the process has been ad hoc. We've had to come up with a process. And as there's been change in staff, I would assume there may have been a change in process, and that could end with these regulations. These regulations would create a standardized process for answering advice, informal advice questions, and for the commission hearing opinions that would persist through time. It would provide something for staff and for the public to use. It would be a really convenient guide for people to look at, and it's designed to not be burdensome. So in terms of what info people have to provide when they're asking questions, it is not overly burdensome. They have to ask the question. They have to provide the facts that are relevant to the question, because you can't answer the question without the facts. They have to provide their name, their title or position, which is highly relevant to the answer to the question, because a lot of times it depends on what office they're holding. And they have to provide their contact info. That includes their email and their phone. And I can tell you that the vast majority of people asking for informal advice already provide this without having to be asked, because you need the first three in order for the question to be asked and answered, and you need the fourth one in order for us to get back in touch with you. So this is really the bare minimum of what's required in order for someone to ask a question, give us the information we need to research and answer it, and to get back in touch with them. So it's not going to create a kind of burden where someone's not able to do it. It's fairly intuitive, and we would definitely not exclude someone because they don't follow the nth degree of this list. If someone doesn't provide a phone number in an email asking for informal advice, I do not think that person is going to have that rejected. It's not going to happen. And if you want, we can change that to an or in the regulation so that they provide an email or a telephone number. I think that's very reasonable. Just as long as we have a way to get in touch with them. That's all that needs to be in here. Whether it's mailing address, phone, email, doesn't matter. We just need to be able to contact the person. So I think that pretty much sums up what I wanted to say in terms of what your questions were at the last meeting. And I'll make myself available if you have more questions based on that information or based on a further review. Definitely glad to answer those.
Commissioners, any questions? Commissioner Lee?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a quick question on the time frame, the response time frame. There's a pretty big gap between the formal advice request versus the formal opinion request and the informal advice, which is like 3 days versus 30 days. Mm-hmm. So is there a reason why? I understand the demand of the staff time and everything else, but usually when people need questions answered, even though they were made informally during the campaign, they need the answers quickly. So 30 days within the campaign schedule could be pretty long. So can you explain why you need 30 days to answer?
Right, for the opinions?
Yeah, for the informal advice part.
Right, so informal advice, in the vast majority of instances, is returned much quicker than that. We endeavor to answer them day of. If we can't, if they're complicated questions that require research, sometimes it takes a day, sometimes it takes a couple days. Sometimes people ask questions that require us to collaborate with other departments. Oftentimes the city attorney's office, we try and work with them very closely to make sure that we're giving the same advice, because as you know, the city attorney's office also gives advice to the regulated community about the laws that the commission administers. So it's definitely important to keep symmetry between what our staff is saying and what the city attorney's office is saying. So that's one factor. They're usually incredibly responsive and quick, but I just want to make the point that it does add another wrinkle, and that's one thing that can require time, is just to have that discussion with them. And sometimes it can be other departments too. Sometimes we get questions from people who work at other departments, and that requires us to talk to people at other departments about their practices, to better understand the facts and do research. Sometimes we have to really spend time to flesh these issues out. Another thing that can add time is communicating with the FPPC. As you know, we implement and enforce on a lot of state laws that are contained in the Political Reform Act. That's, as you know, the state's version of our law, and we have to collaborate with them a lot. Likewise, they are very responsive and usually get back to us very quickly, but that can add another factor that is necessarily going to add time to how much time we have. So the reason why this timeline exists is you could think of this as like the worst case scenario. If someone gives us the most complicated informal advice question and requires us to talk with another department, collaborate with the city attorney, talk to the FPPC, and work internally to flesh out the facts and the questions, this is still the guaranteed turnaround time. An example is right now we're still waiting for the FPPC to return an opinion. I asked for informal advice from the FPPC many months ago, and they have directed that question through their commission's opinion process. So we have not been able to answer that question for months, and that could happen with informal advice. So that's another reason.
Well, for public confidence and public trust, I would suggest that, because you did say staff can extend the response time under certain. So if I could suggest, instead of no later than 30 days, maybe you can put in no later than 15 days. So that at least people will know that within a certain time, they will hear back from us, unless the staff needs additional time. So, because 30 days for a lot of the folks in campaign season is a lifetime.
So just to clarify, you're talking about Regulation 699-12.
Formal advice. Currently, they're proposing that the staff must provide the advice no later than 30 days after a complete and proper request. And I would suggest you put that in 15 days instead of cut that in half, because you already said the staff may extend the response deadline if there's a good cause for delay, such as you're waiting for other folks to respond to you.
I think that sounds like a very reasonable amendment.
Commissioner Rennie?
We heard the woman candidate saying that if we adopt this, we create some great bureaucracy in a sense that somebody can't just call up and get the information that they want so that they can act quickly. What's your response?
It's not the case. It's not the case. To ask for informal advice, you provide your name, you provide your title or position, the question, the facts, and your contact information. That's what's required, and people already give that to us. It's as simple as someone asks the question, and then someone on the engagement and compliance team says, we're going to need to look into that. Can I get your name and your phone number so that I can get back to you?
This proposed regulation doesn't change the practice that presently exists, where the front office was very responsive, it gave her all the answers, and then she believed that with this, that wouldn't happen. But that,
it's not the case. We already have the name and contact information for candidates. So,
all right, I would move that we approve and adopt the proposed regulation.
Okay.
Question?
Commissioner Kopp?
Yeah. What's your comment on the recommendations of Ms. Anita Mayo from Pillsbury?
Is there a particular recommendation?
Yeah, it's dated October 10th. Let me go through them here. The first one, she recommends, based on FPPC law, that the executive director must notify the person requesting within 14 days whether the request will be honored or not.
So I believed that we already had amended this in response to her comment as we understood it. And in her latest rounds of comment, she's now saying that we misunderstood her previous feedback.
Okay, all
So
right.
I think that this is fine, what she's proposing that we,
That's
14 days.
Commissioner Kopp, and I'm sorry to interrupt. I unfortunately need to leave
Oh,
at this time.
my gosh, the
3:45.
witching hour is
The
here?
witching hour has arrived.
Oh,
So I am going to
we
hand
were
over
having so
the.
much fun, Madam Chairwoman.
I will be, I will miss out
Okay,
on the rest
I
of the
will
meeting, but
move.
I will be
Should I
sure to watch
move
it
or
on
stay
TV.
here?
Up to you.
Ms. Pelham,
Should move.
move?
Yep.
Okay.
So, thank you all, and I will see you next month.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
I will.
Then she states on page 2, she being Ms. Mayo, that the effect of an opinion which should be rescinded should not be dependent upon concurrence of the DA or city attorney.
I'm sorry, so
Well, what's your reaction to that
on this
recommendation?
particular comment, let me read it again.
through the chair. I also have a question about that. I think in your draft staff report, you're suggesting that for formal opinions, that if the commission adopts an opinion, but the DA or the city attorney don't concur, then as I read, what I think I read is that you are following the recommendation from the Pillsbury attorney and taking the position that nevertheless, even though there isn't concurrence by the DA and city attorney, that the commission's administrative enforcement would be restricted and the commission executive director would be precluded from making a finding of probable cause. Am I reading that correctly? Is that?
That's correct.
Okay. Because I do have some concerns about how that would work in the real world. You have a candidate who has wants to feel confident that they can move forward. You have a opinion from the commission, which I understand hopefully that there would be engagement with the district attorneys or city attorney. But if, in this scenario that we're talking about, obviously there wasn't, because you end up with an opinion by the commission that is not concurred in, and then that means that that candidate is vulnerable to legal action but protected from administrative action. And I guess what I really want to focus on is, what do you think you would do in that circumstance to resolve that very unhappy, confused state of affairs? Whether you're still protecting that person from an administrative proceeding, that's fine if we've already gone through the commission with that, but then what would you do?
So it's really a question of whether the commission would first determine through an opinion that certain conduct is lawful, and then turn around subsequently through an enforcement proceeding find it to be unlawful. And-
Right, I understand that, but
And the regulations would basically assume that the commission would not do that. That if the commission were to find through an opinion that certain conduct were lawful, that then the executive director would not find probable cause that such conduct constituted a violation, because why would we bring something to the commission for an enforcement proceeding if the commission had previously opined that it was lawful? That's the thinking behind this provision.
correct. I understand that. I guess then what I'm focusing on, because the attorney points out that action doesn't depend on the concurrence, although if you want protection from criminal or civil liability,
Right.
which could be brought by the DA, the city attorney, or a third party, that's the scenario. So we're not
Right.
going to bring an administrative enforcement action because we gave this advice that's in conflict with these other elected officials. But now my question to you is how, because the regulations don't really talk about that. Now, how do we reconcile the issue where there's a lack of concurrence? And more specifically, one of the minor changes that I wanted to make, in order to get this information to the candidate, it says that the commission adopts, if the commission adopts a opinion in a session like this, that the executive director has 3 days to provide that to the DA and city attorney, and then they have 10 days to say whether or not they concur. There's added language there that says that it could be provided in 3 days or later if the executive director deems necessary. I guess I want to strike that. I think it's going to be really important to the candidate to know that the opinion that this commission adopted has got the concurrence of the legal enforcement entities, the DA and city attorney, as soon as possible. So that's one thing. And I guess what I was really looking for you to say is that we would all work really hard to either bring it to the Board of Supervisors to have the legislative intent clarified, or back to the commission to have the disagreement between the various members of the city family resolved, because it highlights that this commission and staff have a sort of quasi-legislative role, and we want to make sure that all of the entities that have legislative responsibility in the city are talking to each other and on the same page.
Right. So I'll address both of those questions in turn. So first question, how would we resolve it? The regulations create a timeline for when the commission must hear an opinion. That was the topic of some discussion in the last meeting. The reason that that timeline exists is so that we can have that discussion with the city attorney and the district attorney's offices before the opinion comes before the commission.
No, hopefully, yeah.
That's why that time exists, so that we can research it, come up with what we propose, and then talk to the other offices, hopefully to resolve it beforehand. So first answer is hopefully that wouldn't happen, because we would work it out in advance. If it did happen, meaning the commission did decide to move forward with a finding and an opinion that contradicted what either the city attorney or district attorney's offices said, it would be because the commission affirmatively disagrees with what those offices are saying. Hopefully you would already have their thoughts before you, because the staff have had the time to research and talk with them. So then if you did disagree with what the city attorney and district attorneys, or one of them, offices were saying, you make the finding through an opinion. What would we do after that? I mean, you could pass a regulation clarifying it. You have the power to do that. You could send the regulation to the board, and then if the board doesn't do anything, then that would become law. So that would be one way to resolve it, because we'd be talking about an ambiguity in the law, most likely, that our offices disagree about. So you could resolve it through regulation. If it can't be done through regulation, you may have to go through an ordinance. That would be one way to do it.
I would like, if I mean, my preference would be that it would be explicit that we at least notify the city attorney and DA, give them a copy of the draft opinion, make sure that what you're talking about, which makes total sense to me, that there be communication in advance so that we don't end up with some big public unexpected dispute about how one of our laws should be enforced. But that wasn't in there, and so all I was left with is this idea that there would be different estoppel effect if the commission acts versus if the commission acts with the concurrence of the DA. But if you want to put in there a note that says that we'll copy it to them, or some kind of a flag that says this is coming way in now, so that we don't end up with that inconsistency that leaves the candidate vulnerable to some enforcement and not others.
So you would like to see language in the regulations that requires staff to at least initiate that dialogue before the...
forward a copy of a draft opinion, or, consult, confer, or something.
So I would propose doing that on page 3 in section 699-12A2, the process for reviewing requests and considering and adopting opinions. In subsection C, where it says, upon receipt of a complete and proper request, the executive director or other staff shall prepare a draft opinion that addresses the questions posed in the request, period. We could add something there, language like what you just said. Staff shall transmit the draft opinion to both the city attorney and district attorney's offices so that those offices may share their analysis of the issues contained in the opinion.
Well, wait a moment. Is their opinion or one of them going to be binding on us?
No, the commission always retains the ability to decide the opinion however it sees fit, whether or not the district attorney or city attorney concur.
How much more time will that take?
I think that we can do it within the timeline that I've proposed in here, which is 45 days after we determined that the request for an opinion is proper and complete.
Anything
I think
else,
it's just a courtesy.
Commissioner Ambrose? On that paragraph of the Mrs. Mayo's letter?
No, thank you.
Okay. All right, let's get back to rescission. She says that shouldn't be dependent upon concurrence of city attorney, district attorney. Do you agree?
I'm not sure that I understand what she is commenting on here.
Well, I think I do. And I notice she's here so she can make that clear when we take public testimony. Next thing she recommends is requesting informal advice. Claims the regulation as drafted will prevent anyone, including an attorney, from asking for informal advice regarding hypothetical situations or general questions. And that's true, right?
No, that is not the case.
That's not true.
No.
Thought I read it in one of these sections. It's not true.
It's not true that attorneys would be precluded from asking hypothetical questions. Such questions
I don't
would
care
not
about
be,
attorneys necessarily alone.
No one would be
Any
precluded.
person.
No one would be precluded from asking such questions. All this says is that such questions are not requests for informal advice. But as I talked about earlier, they would be considered general inquiries, and we seek to answer all of those questions.
Then on page 3, she refers to the timeline based on a specific number of days after receipt of the request. instead of specific time after a determination. Is there merit to that?
Yeah, I thought that we had already addressed this comment in a previous version. What I'm seeing here is that apparently we misunderstood what she was asking for. I think this is a reasonable request, and I think it's easily changed in the draft.
Okay.
I think we can do that.
So noted. And then the next one, she advocates, as a matter of substance, I'd say that the conformity with respect to informal advice should be a complete defense to any enforcement proceeding. What's your comment on that?
I'm sorry, I was consulting with the deputy
Huh?
attorney. Can you repeat
Okay,
the
well,
question?
read that paragraph, please.
I'm sorry, can you specify which one?
Yes, page 3, under Regulation 699-12B3, effective informal advice. Second paragraph, she says conformity of the informal advice should be a complete defense, not a mitigating fact. You agree?
No, I disagree. Formal opinions have the effect, essentially, of immunity because the executive director will not make a finding of probable cause that certain conduct is unlawful if the commission has already determined through an opinion that such conduct is lawful. Advice does not have that same exact effect. It could have, in effect, almost that same effect, depending on certain circumstances. So you would look at things like how well was the question asked? Did the person give all of the facts? Was the answer actually what the person is attesting? Because you have to remember that informal advice is provided in so many different ways. It can be through a phone call. It can be through a very short email. It can be through an in-person conversation that happens briefly in our office. So I don't think that you would want to ascribe the power to those very brief interactions to confer immunity. Because you can imagine people would come to you and say, but someone told me in the office that I could do such and such, therefore I'm immune from enforcement. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's a good policy. I think that it's better to say, okay, we will ascribe a level of mitigation to that that's appropriate for what the circumstances
All right, last paragraph, Ms. Mayo says that this can be used, what I would say is precedent for others with similar facts and circumstances, and that should be explicit in the regulation. I mean, that's just a matter of logic that you'd use, but should it be explicit?
Are you talking about this last paragraph?
Subparagraph C should be added to indicate that informal written advice may serve as guidance for others with similar facts and circumstances. I don't know.
I mean,
huh?
I guess we could do that. I think that it's self-evident, but I think we can
I mean,
have that.
perforce it would be. Any attorney or campaign manager worth his or her salt would use them. All right. And the last one is about informal assistance, including a definition of who may request it. And she's got 5 categories. Is that needed?
No, I would really counsel you against creating rules for what I'm calling general inquiries and what Ms. Mayo is calling informal assistance. We already answered these questions insofar as we can, and insofar as it doesn't require us to make novel calls, items of first impression. I don't think that it's needed to create a whole set of rules about what people should do when they want to call up and just ask question.
All right, I will accept your advice. Any other questions of Mr. Ford? Hearing none. Public comment.
Thank you, Commissioners. Mr. Rene, excuse me, I identified you as Commissioner Keene. I know he's long gone. Sorry for the confusion. Anyway, my name is Lou Ann Basson again, and I want to speak
You mean it's still Lou Ann Basson?
It is still. I'm not changing it now.
All right.
Do you realize what kind of havoc that would cause with the Ethics Commission's computers? I want to speak directly regarding page 4. So if everyone could turn to page 4, I would appreciate it. Regulation 699-12 sub B-1, the informal advice. I contest strongly Mr. Ford's assertion that none of this is really going to be required. It states a request for informal advice must clearly state all of the following in order to be a complete and proper request. And there are 5 items listed. That informal advice is being requested: the name, title, or position, email address, and the mailing address or telephone number of the persons requesting the advice. And then it talks about authorized representative, all material facts, and the question. So I'll go back to the example I gave earlier of my email to Johnny Hosey, the front office staff. Johnny, what time is the deadline for electronic filing? 5 p.m. or midnight? Okay, in that email, I did not state that informal advice was being requested. I did not state my name or my title or my email address or my mailing address or my telephone number. Do you know how long that would take me to type for every single email that I sent to Johnny? It's ridiculous. This is so much red tape and cumbersome and burdensome to an individual and to a candidate.
Did Johnny answer your question?
Yes, in 5 minutes.
Okay, fine.
Yes, but if this regulation goes into effect, I would have to have an email that's 20 times longer, putting in all of this needless information, material facts. Johnny, I plan to file electronically sometime today. I'm not sure because I don't know if it should be 5 o'clock or midnight. Those are the material facts. And then it has to be clearly, concisely, and completely as possible. So given my experience with the Ethics Commission, I can only envision that they would challenge, it wasn't concise, rejected. It wasn't complete, rejected. This is a ridiculous regulation. And then moving on to Part B, it says it's not...
Before you...
I'm sorry.
How would you change all material facts?
What time? Just leave it simple. Why do you need to have a whole paragraph of material facts? I'm planning to file...
Because I won't know how to decide it.
You won't know how to
I don't have all material facts.
What time is electronic filing deadline? That's it. What else do I need to add? That I'm planning to file electronic...
Maybe you don't understand. Are you suggesting that we shouldn't require all material facts in a question?
If there's not enough facts, I suppose the staff would write back and ask for clarification.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just looking at this from the standpoint of what could go wrong, given my recent experiences with the commission. And this says it must clearly state all of this. And then in Part B, it talks about the requester's duties. Well, me as a candidate, I am the candidate. I am the treasurer. I am the committee. I am the campaign manager. I am the volunteer coordinator. So when I send an email saying, what time is the filing deadline, I have no idea what role I'm playing at that time. I'm just trying to get the document filed. Am I doing it as the treasurer, the committee, the candidate? I don't know. And does it really matter? No. So again, my comments are that Mr. Ford is asking for ridiculous amounts of information when your whole public purpose is to assist us as candidates in this whole process, not to make our life a living hell. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment?
Sorry to disappoint.
Charles Marsteller,
Here I am.
for the record.
Sorry to disappoint you. I know you want to really get through this. I hate to say this. I'm not sure you're really ready for prime time.
Why?
This does seem to me to be cumbersome, and it could
Be
well
what?
be cumbersome
Cumbersome, all right,
to the public, to you,
okay.
both parties. I think that putting some heads together on this with some interested persons, I don't know if this went to an IP meeting, but I don't think it did.
It did.
Oh, it did.
2 IP meetings, July 31st and August 1st.
I thought those were the IP meetings on the,
They were dual purpose. Both items were
Oh,
agendized
okay.
for the meetings.
then I blew it.
All right, don't worry. Just
Technically,
go
you-
ahead as
But
to
the
why it's
reality
not
is
ready
that
for prime time.
there was much more focus on the other issue than there was on this at that interested persons meeting. No one really discussed this
I don't know.
at all.
What was the other issue?
It was the new desktop or dashboard, right? No, public financing. Sorry.
All right, so there
I've
were,
been to a number
all
of
right,
these.
2 topics, and
So in
not
any
enough
event,
time on this. All right.
It could be that there's some other people in the room today that were raising some very good questions that I thought required some consideration, and you might just want to make it formal and informal advice and have simple informal advice, and then a more formal process for the informal advice that requires you to maintain the record of the contact. And by the way, how much of this is old or archaic or existing language, or is it all new? There are no regs at all.
Through the chair to Mr. Ford, how
I'm
much
sorry.
is new?
This is all new. We don't have regulations on this yet.
I am surprised. It reminds me of the Ethics Commission in 1996 and 7, but
Oh,
we
no.
won't get any further on that.
No, now you're being cruel.
I'm sorry, but things were pretty cumbersome then.
Okay.
And I know you're improving tremendously. I want to say that for the record. But in any event, I would suggest maybe an IP meeting and that Commissioner Ambrose attend, because she had some very good points, and that some of the people in the room attend, including Anita Mayo, who I greatly respect and I think made some excellent points. So thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, Ms. Mayor, now you're properly introduced with an accolade and more paper, which I'm not going to have time to read. Maybe somebody's a speed reader. Please proceed.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Anita Mayo from Pillsbury Winthrop Shaw Pittman. I have the following comments regarding the proposed regulations. Regulation 699-12A2 and 699-12B2 provide that upon receiving a request for an opinion or informal advice, the executive director will determine whether the request constitutes a complete and proper request and transmit that determination to the requester within 2 days after the determination is made. But there is no time frame for making that determination. A better approach is to give the requester a time certain after receipt of the request, such as 7 days or 14 days.
What time? What do you suggest?
Well,
How much time?
The FPPC is 14 days, if that would be helpful.
Oh,
for
yeah,
staff.
that's the 14 days.
Yes, yes. On Regulation 699-12B1 will prevent any person, including an attorney, campaign consultant, campaign treasurer, from seeking informal advice on behalf of a client unless the client is disclosed. Over the years, I have sought informal advice from commission staff about various issues without having to disclose the identities of my clients. I just distributed examples of such advice that I've received in the past, one from 1996 and one in March of this year. This is a common practice with most ethics agencies, including the FPPC and the Oakland Public Ethics Commission. Such practices encourage compliance with the law, and I urge you to continue that practice. Second, this regulation prohibits requesting advice about hypothetical situations or general questions about the interpretation of the city's political laws. The examples just submitted to you involved hypotheticals and the interpretation of laws. If attorneys are unable to ask commission staff about the interpretation of laws and regulations that the commission administers and enforces, this will significantly and negatively impact our ability to understand these laws, and as a result, we will not be able to properly advise our clients regarding the same. This position is contrary to a provision in the FPPC regulations which permits any person with a duty to advise other persons relating to their duties or actions under the Act to request informal assistance. The FPPC thus recognizes the value of providing informal assistance to attorneys regarding various laws under its jurisdictions. To accommodate this concern, the Commission should adopt the approach used by the FPPC, which includes 3 methods for providing opinions and advice: formal opinions, formal written advice, and informal assistance. This latter category should permit requests about the interpretations of law and the application of hypotheticals without disclosing the identity of clients. And finally, following state law, if a person receives informal written advice from commission staff and conforms their conduct with the facts and recommendations stated therein, such conformity should be a complete defense in an enforcement proceeding initiated by the commission and evidence of good faith conduct in any other civil or criminal proceeding. Informal written advice should also serve as guidance for others with similar facts and circumstances. Thank you.
Okay. Any questions of Ms. Mayo, who's devoted time and effort to her letter of October 10th and then these examples, which I guess we'll read after the meeting. What about 14 days to get an opinion?
Yep, I think that's very reasonable, and I think
okay.
Mr. Shen has drafted language to make that change.
Okay, and so that can be included?
Yep, absolutely. In fact, we've prepared a number of changes in response to Ms. Mayo's comments, and through the chair, if I can, I'd like to say that Ms. Mayo has been the stakeholder that's been the most engaged, and frankly, the only stakeholder that's provided substantive comments. Yeah. And I think that today that we have created amendments to these regulations that are responsive to almost all of her recommendations. So I think that you can get this item past the post today. Some of hers I disagree with, like the idea that attorneys will not be able to call and ask general questions. They absolutely can. Anyone can. It just will not be considered informal advice under the charter, and therefore will not be a mitigating factor in an enforcement decision. If the attorney wants to identify who the client is and make that question informal advice, then the client would enjoy as a mitigating factor in a future enforcement decision. That's why we're asking that the attorney identify the client, since we have to know who to give that mitigating effect to. But otherwise, I think we have a number of amendments here that are responsive to her comments that we can run through in hopes that you could pass the regulations today.
Okay, where's the 14 days?
The 14 days.
Chair Kopp, may I make a comment with respect to
while you look that up, go ahead.
The reason why it's important for request for interpretations of law and the use of hypotheticals is when we're counseling clients, it's very helpful to us if we do get informal advice from the commission staff. We realize that in many times we can't, it's not a complete defense, obviously, because it's informal. And generally, over the years, I've been told by commission staff, whether it's in writing or orally, that we're going to give you the most conservative advice because it's not, a formal request. But that's still very helpful when I get, whether it's an email back or written letter back that's informal advice. That is something that, I can pass on to the clients, whether it's one client or several clients. But clients, we shouldn't have to identify our clients in order to get informal advice from the commission. And we don't have to do that when we get that advice from the FPPC or from the Oakland Public Ethics Commission. So I don't understand why that is an issue with being able to get informal written advice from the commission without having to identify.
What's
our
the
client.
rationale for not disclosing the client?
Because clients don't want to, we don't want to have to identify who our clients are, for one thing, and the nature of their particular actions, what they may be thinking or what they may be doing. That's all privileged information. So I don't think that should be in the public domain. But what we're trying to do, the regulated communities, to make certain that we completely understand what the law is. And the best entity to go to that is the Ethics Commission, because you have the responsibility for that.
If there's a proceeding against the client's going to waive the informal advice, right? So what difference does it make whether the client's identified now or
Well, typically,
a year from now?
hopefully, we give accurate advice so that there is no proceeding against the client.
No, I know
is the
that, but
purpose.
I'm talking about the commission's informal advice. If somehow a proceeding by the commission begins, the client's identity is disclosed. And
That
it's
doesn't
known.
typically happen with the clients that I have.
I don't. Do you have any thought on that? I don't see the difference. Okay, where were we? 14 days.
Yeah, I think perhaps we could go through all the regulations, and Deputy City Attorney Shen could propose amendments that are responsive
Oh,
to Mayo's
it's going to be an amendment, huh?
That's what I would
see 14
recommend.
days. I'll simplify it. So
Yes.
it's coming as an amendment. All right.
So I think at this point in the discussion, there's probably a number of amendments that have been discussed, and let me just summarize them as best as I can, Mr. Ford.
Now, what I'd like you to do is go page by page through here.
I will do my best, Chair Cop. So on page 2, Regulation 699-12A-2, big A, so the very bottom of page 2. The third sentence currently reads, "The determination shall be transmitted to the requester within 2 days after the determination is made." That is where we're going to amend that to read, "within 14 days after the request is received."
All right.
Okay? Going on to the following.
All right, wait a minute, Mr. Shen. Do you want a motion to adopt that amendment?
I think we can do one motion at the end.
One motion, all right.
If the commission's amenable. Okay. Top of page 3, big C. Inserting between the first and second sentence. So the first sentence starting upon receipt, the second sentence starting the commission shall. This is following up on Commissioner Ambrose's suggestion. We're proposing to insert a sentence that says staff will transmit the draft opinion to the city attorney and district attorney offices for their review. Going on to the next page, bottom of page 4, Regulation 699-12A2, reviewing requests and issuing informal advice. First, we need to change the numbering of that regulation. It actually should be in the parentheses B instead of A. I think that was just
Wait, parenthesis D?
So at the bottom of page 4, that regulation.
699-12 A2.
Right. That is a typo. It should be B instead of A.
All right. So that should be D.
Yeah, and
Okay.
to make it parallel with the very first amendment, that third sentence should also replace 2 days after the determination is made with 14 days after the request is received. And lastly, Mr. Ford had another suggestion, also picking up an amendment and suggestion from Commissioner Lee. The following page, top of page 5, big B. So the first sentence should read, staff must provide the advice to the requester no later than 15 days after staff has determined that the request is complete and proper.
Okay. Everybody understand those proposed amendments?
Yeah, or I should probably say request for informal advice is complete.
Huh?
Right. And the very last one is the numbering for the following regulation. So that is another typo. It should be regulation 699-12B-3 rather than A.
Okay. Anything of substance in that subsection change?
No, I don't believe so, Chair.
All right, I guess public comment should be taken, but please don't repeat points made before.
And if I may.
I mean, I can't stop you from repeating them, but I'm going to enforce the 3-minute rule without beneficial treatment. Yes, Ms. Ambrose?
I had two other that we talked about that didn't get picked up. One, I think that this commenter was going to comment on. You had said that we could change the requirements for requesting informal advice to just make it clear that all we need to know is how to get back to somebody. So we need their email address or their mailing address or their telephone number. So I'd like to recommend that we make that change. So it's just, how do we answer your question? And then I'd also, as you had just pointed out, I wanted to make the change to say that after a commission adopts an opinion, that the executive director will send it to the district attorney and the city attorney within 3 days, and there's no need for any extensions. So if you can include that in your litany, then we're ready to go. Thank you.
All right, so ordered.
And I missed one other amendment, my apologies. So at the bottom of page 3, Regulation 699-12A4, rescinding opinions. And this is taking to one of Ms. Mayo's recommendations into account. We can strike the phrase concurred in by both the district attorney and city attorney. As she pointed out in her letter, the concurrence of the city attorney, district attorney doesn't really bear on sort of the impact of the commission's decision.
All right. So ordered. I have a question at the bottom of that page I forgot to ask you. Under B11, is not made in writing if the requester desires the advice to be delivered in writing. That's based upon a theory of what? Equality? Proportionality?
It's based on a practice that we already have, which is that if someone calls the office, asks a question, we provide the answer on the phone, and then someone says, please send me that in writing. We say, please send us the question in writing, so that the commission will be able to see what the question was.
Fine, understood. All right. Yes, ma'am, Ms. Besson.
Thank you again. I am very distressed that you are leaving in 699-12B-1, even with the few amendments by Commissioner Ambrose. I mean, when I send an email, all you have to do is hit reply. I don't need to say, here's my email. I don't need to put that in there. You just hit reply, and it goes back to me. It's really simple. So I just, again, object to the entire regulation. It is just needless red tape and an opportunity for the commission to just nitpick the candidates. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Anita Mayo again. Actually, just have a question. So since you're not going to include informal assistance in the regulation, you're indicating that we can still email or request advice regarding the interpretation of laws and hypotheticals. It just will not be considered informal advice.
Through the chair, that is correct. We will consider a general inquiry, and we will endeavor to answer all of those questions. We may decline to answer them, as I talked about, if it doesn't apply to an actual client. If it's just a question and you acknowledge to us, this is not for a client, this is just a general curiosity of mine. If it is particularly voluminous or requires us to answer a question of first impression, we may decline to exercise interpretive power in that circumstance. But I think it's already our policy. I know it's already our policy and will continue to be to try and provide you with absolutely as much information as we can, because obviously that's in our interest too, to have you helping people comply with the laws, since it furthers compliance all around. So definitely we would still answer those questions.
Okay, and I just want to point out that, clearly based on what was going on in 1996, those types of questions were considered informal advice.
Were what?
Were considered informal advice.
Oh.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, any other public comments? Hearing no request. Do we have a motion?
Withdraw my original motion and make a new motion that we adopt the regulations with the amendments that have been discussed.
All right, motion is to adopt the regulations presented as amended. Is there a second? Seconded by Commissioner Lee. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? There appear to be no votes, and therefore the motion is adopted and the regulations are consequently adopted. Number 6, agenda item 6. Okay. Mr. Ford.
Get to work.
Thank you, Commissioners. Agenda item 6 sets forth my monthly policy report, where I update you on the status of projects that you have selected as the commission.
Okay, let me shorten it.
Yep.
Have all commissioners read this neat but not gaudy policy report?
Yes.
Okay. Are there any questions about any part of it? There appear to be no questions, and we thank you for your economic presentation. All right, agenda item number 7 is the quarterly.
Comment?
Yeah, public comment.
What?
We should still take public comment.
All right,
6.
public comment. I hear no public comment. I'll call agenda item 7 again, quarterly policy prioritization. Mr. Ford.
Thank you, Chair Kopp, Sitting Chair Kopp. Agenda item 7 is the quarterly policy prioritization plan. So to give background on this, you'll remember that in June, you adopted for the first time a quarterly policy prioritization plan, where you selected 3 projects. We talked about this earlier, that you want the policy division to devote its resources to. So as promised, this is the opportunity for you to quarterly reassess that, look at the status of the projects as outlined in the report in item 6, and to determine whether or not you would like to continue with those priorities or change them. The recommendation that I've included here, since there's only one of me still, and probably will still only be one of me in the division until early next year, that you direct the policy division to focus on 2 projects. I think that 2 projects I can handle and deliver quality work product. More than that, I start to be spread a little thin on the projects, and the time horizon is going to necessarily have to be extended on them. But with 2, I think I can still move with a good pace. And I'm recommending that those 2 projects be to continue with the public financing review project. Under agenda item 4, you directed me to prepare a set of regulations and a set of ordinances. So that task would be encapsulated under this project. Just based on prior experience, I think if we're going to move forward with regulations and ordinances, it's definitely going to take a good amount of staff bandwidth and probably occupy a few agenda items in your future meetings. So I think that would nicely fill up one of these two proposed policy projects. And for the second one, I would really like to make more progress on the CFRO, Campaign Finance Reform Ordinance regulations. As I mentioned earlier, there are a number of changes that need to be made to those regulations. There are some mistakes. There are some instances where the regulations are not in line with the code. Some numbers are off. The code has changed, and the regs have not changed with the code. So we should really bring those into line. Another issue is the Anti-Corruption and Accountability Ordinance went into effect in part in June, and the remainder will go into effect January 1, 2019. There are a number of code sections in that ordinance that would really benefit from some clarification through regulation. And I think that it would be a very good idea to devote some time to preparing preemptively those regulations, trying to preempt some issues that might come up so that we have something to work with once we start actually having requests for advice or potentially enforcement matters that pertain to those new code sections. So that would be another reason to include that. Since in the public financing project, I'm including some reforms to or changes to the regulations. Perhaps there would be some way to combine them, to have those go through at the same time. But I think conduct the processes separately, and then at the end, perhaps merge them into one set of regulations when we send them to the board. Something to think about down the road that might speed the process up. So those are my recommendations. I've tried
All right,
to include this here.
Comments from commissioners or questions from commissioners?
Yes, I have a question, and
Why don't you get up closer?
I have a question, and referring to what you know is a subject matter of which I had great interest. That is to create limits on contributions to independent expenditure committees, and a draft ordinance has been provided. And I take it what you're saying is that you don't believe you can get to that within the next 2-3 months.
I'll put it this way. If the commission were to identify that as a policy priority, I would obviously devote resources to it, but the amount of time I could spend on that and the other two projects, if you decide to move forward with those two, they're going to have to come down. I mean, I have a zero-sum amount of hours, work hours, and I have a lot of other projects that I have to do in terms of providing advice to other divisions, assisting with advice to the regulated community, media relations, legislative affairs, et cetera. So to answer your question, I could do it, but it would take longer. It would make all of the projects take longer.
Well, as I understand it, one, that they have provided the staff with a proposed piece of legislation, and did that some months ago, and that there are outside organizations that stand ready to give whatever assistance the commission needs to try and get that in a posture where it can be discussed in the public and asked and determine whether the commission wants to go forward. And I guess my concern is that I guess my concern is that if this is a policy or a provision that the commission would like to advance, it ought to be done.
No, so you're definitely right that drafting the ordinance would not be the majority of what I'm doing, because we have a draft right here. It's page 11
Right.
on agenda item 7. So you're correct. I would not be spending the time, if this were a project, necessarily drafting. That's done. But I don't think that means it wouldn't be time consuming. I would definitely have to be analyzing this. I think the city attorney's office would probably want to be part of this process too, looking at the constitutional aspects of it.
Right.
So that's going to add a factor. I imagine we would probably have interested persons meetings about this as part of the process. Stakeholders are going to want to weigh in on it. There will probably be amendments proposed by various people. I'm just speaking from previous experiences I've seen with
Yeah,
ordinances.
there have to be public meetings and obviously try and building a record
Right.
to support it. I agree.
I'm just thinking back to the ACAO. Even once it was fully drafted, that I felt like that was kind of the beginning of the process. That the process of working it through, legislatively, was really where the bulk of the time was. So I completely agree with you. We've got a basis here to start with.
Okay, what's the ACL?
That's the Anti-Corruption and Accountability Ordinance, the big ordinance that the Commission approved back in April.
When's your term expire?
February 1st.
All right. I'm prepared to make a motion that we create limits on, or limit on contributions, i.e. committee, so that we may have the benefit of potential action before Commissioner Rennie departs. And let's take public comment. All right. Ms.
Commissioner Cobb,
Pelham?
can I just clarify your motion? Was that to substitute the
Yeah, I'd
ordinance?
substitute that
For what?
for the CFRO regulations review. All right, public comment. Are you seconding that motion?
Yeah, sure, I'll second it.
All right. Motion is pending.
Hi, Commissioners. Charlie Marsteller again. Great minds think alike. I was just going to make the same recommendation. Given the fact that Commissioner Rennie is leaving, I was looking at the bill. 90% of it, not maybe 90, but 75 to 80% of it is definition. Some of those may be novel and require some work, but I was going to say the core of the bill itself is relatively simple, and the concepts are simple. The constitutionality is another question, but this body has the ability to put this ordinance on the ballot, which it could do in 2019. And that's a decision that I don't think you'll belabor. I think it could be quickly dealt with, especially if you know that one of the proponents of this measure is leaving. So as a courtesy, I would recommend you.
How about the group or groups Commissioner Rennie mentioned? Are you familiar with them? Do you know if they participate? I mean, you can't commit them, but do you have a reasonably good feeling they will participate?
Well, you have to build a record, that's for sure. And we do need those people to participate to help that process of building a record. So
you've got to let them.
I will tell you that we have an
Okay.
active context list, so we'll be able to implement that.
Okay, well, spread that information.
Thank you.
All right, any other public comment?
Anita Mayo, Pillsbury Winthrop. Just a little confused about why the commission would want to propose legislation that's been declared unconstitutional. And in fact, there was similar legislation, or was interpreted in your previous version of the campaign law about limits.
I'll answer you. My answer would be that I trust that what, if anything, is adopted, it will not be unconstitutional. In other words, hope springs eternal.
I see.
And that's the purpose of the time and attention and the effort with groups which are, I'll characterize, experts in the field, as well as our staff, which is composed of people who are experts in the field.
Understand that.
All right.
Just, based on general Supreme Court precedents, there are major issues with it. Thank you.
My deceased friend and lawyer, Supervisor Fred S. Cooper of Alameda County, said, Ms. Mayo, anything which makes work for lawyers can't be all bad. Okay, any other public comment? If not,
No,
questions?
I want to add one other thing, if I may, Chair Kopp, before the
Yes.
commission votes on this matter.
Uh-huh. What?
So I just want to say that for my own part, that I well recognize the many things that Pat has on his plate. And I agree with him, actually, that updating the C4 regs is actually a very critically important task.
Why?
But because
Why?
clearly,
Why is it critical?
because they've been out of date for a number of years.
So what?
Not-
What is, show me the effect. Show me a complaint which hasn't matured or hasn't been perfected. I don't see any.
Well, it's not necessarily about an ethics complaint. It's more about compliance and making sure candidates understand the lay of the land. And I believe that the staff has done its best to bootstrap in a very uncomfortable situation with these out-of-date regulations, but they certainly need to be addressed. But I clearly understand from the commission that you do want to devote attention to the proposed limit on contributions to IE committees. So to give Pat a little bit more bandwidth, I will commit to speaking with Commissioner Rennie and any other groups that he's already brought into this effort to start the assessment of the legal issues, which I think is plain to everyone in this room,
It'll
which are
be a
substantial
great-
prior to the next meeting,
All right.
but not necessarily make any change to the policy prioritization plan at this time. So that would just be a suggestion on my part to keep
All
all
right.
these different balls moving as fast as we can.
All right, it's up to those who vote. Any questions, comments? If not, I'm going to ask all in favor of those two policy projections taking precedence as fast as possible.
Well, the comment that I want to make is essentially the same, that it's a matter of balancing. I am concerned about the regulations being out of whatever date because of the new law that went into effect that we were in a hurry to get in place by January. I think if we're going to be effective and we're going to impose additional requirements, then we need to follow up and make sure everybody understands what they are and how to apply them and not bollocks up the works or waste a bunch of campaign time. With respect to this issue, I'm not nearly as up to date as all of you are with the legal issues, but I understand the unconstitutional claim. And I think that the suggestion that we work through with the lawyers, like I'd like to know who they are that drafted it, what their strategy is, what their position. So we could have discussions, we could have a session where people come together and talk about it in anticipation of bringing it to the commission without taking up Pat Ford's time in the short term. I don't know how you balance it, but I don't want to, I hate to interrupt the priority program because I like to support the staff.
I want to comment on that. We are a commission. We're presented with 3 pages of potential policy, more than 3 pages projects.
I know. It's a
It
lot
is
of-
our responsibility to exercise our individual judgments. And that motion, which is pending, is based upon my judgment. And it may be influenced a bit by sentiment, because I came of age and through experience of respecting colleagues and their particular problems and interests. And this has been an interest of Commissioner Rennie. I share the interest. So do I hear from tens of San Franciscans about this issue of independent expenditures, and I respect the viewpoint expressed by Ms. Mayo as much as I do the viewpoint expressed by Mr. Marsteller and, I hope, common cause, Mr. Marsteller. So I'm prepared to vote, and you want to be heard, Commissioner Lee?
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Chair. I just have a question. Is it possible for us to hold the IP meeting between now and the next meeting over the IE proposal? How quick can you put that together?
Maybe I can answer that question. I do want to also frame this. This is not a disrespect to any member of the commission who's exercising a strong interest in pursuing legislation that's of interest. It is our responsibility to be able to tell you as best we can with all candor about the work that's before us so that we are effective. And to help manage expectations of yours and the public's about what we are capable of achieving at this point. I believe it is going to be very difficult to have an interested persons meeting that is effective and useful to you at this next meeting of yours on November the 17th. Between now and then, that would be the next commission meeting is November the 17th. The following commission meeting is scheduled for December 21st, which is a Friday before the end of the year holidays. And so given that we are in a mode to put together public financing regulations and legislation, that we also have preparation underway for the anti-corruption and accountability ordinance, which will become operative on the 1st of January, which we still have to do a significant amount of work to achieve. Given that we are also going into some discussions about e-filing for all, given that there are also CFRO regulations that are out there that we do think need some attention, we are very, very, it's difficult to deliver that, I think. And I don't want the commission to have the expectation that that will be delivered in a meaningful way. So that would be my rather long answer to your brief question. I think it's important for us to make sure that we're bringing back to you valuable insights, thoughtful analysis, so that you can make informed decisions. I'm concerned that we would not have the opportunity to do that by our November 16th, 17th meeting, which would mean we would have to have the interested persons meeting, the report concluded by November the 9th. I would also just note we have a couple of other wrinkles in early December. This doesn't mean we don't put it there, but I just want to frame the time frame that we are looking at. The first week of, or the first part of December, a number of the senior staff are going to the annual Kogel conference, and so that's going to put a bit of a pinch on our ability to turn things around quickly for you in terms of new issues. So I think if the commission wants to proceed with this, if this is a policy issue that you want to see us move with, it will significantly impact our ability to deliver some of those other items at this particular juncture. So I just want to make sure that is conveyed so that you know whatever choices you want to exercise are considering that set of factors as well.
I totally recognize the time constraints and dueling responsibilities, but at the same time, I'm trying to find a way to get, because the IE issue is also included in the Priority 1, the public finance program review. That was sort of included in the report. So if I may ask Commissioner Rennie, my understanding of the IP meetings, of course, we're not just going to put a meeting together and have people come. There are a lot of prep work and there are a lot of follow-up activities. And to what extent, if we were to go this route, to have an IP meeting, can outside organizations help put together this IP meeting for the commission, so that already we know that there are interested groups who are interested in this area, and they would definitely want to come, I'm sure, to the initial meeting. And if there is a way for people to help the staff to put that meeting together, that one meeting together, to get the conversation started, and we may proceed without this as a top priority, or we may put this on the top priority. But I just think that the minimal thing that we can do right now, or we can consider, is see if we can get the IP meeting, to get the folks together in one room to talk about this, so that some of us can decide how to proceed. So my question is it possible, if we were to get interested parties to help staff put together the IP meeting between now and November. Is that possible? Is it feasible?
I think the question of can we have a meeting, we can identify if there is a room, we can identify a time for the room, we can notice the room. In terms of preparation to make it the most meaningful session, we would have to do some liaison work with whoever the groups are that are interested, identify a list of questions, do some try to get at what are the questions that are going to be helpful to bring back information to you all about. If we are able to find a room, is it theoretically possible to do the meeting? Yes, of course. We can coordinate with people. I'm just wanted to be very clear that will mean some of the public financing work and the ACAO preparation work will be set aside for the time that is happening. So we have to be careful that those also may not be delivered in the time frame that the commission would hope and has planned for.
I would say what makes a meeting an ethics commission IP meeting as opposed to just like an external roundtable of groups is that it is organized by the ethics commission. So I think in order for it to be an ethics commission interested persons meeting, we would necessarily have to, as Director Pelham said, reserve the room, put it on our website, and that's not what's time consuming. I can do that, fairly quickly. I think it's to what extent will we then be able to internalize what people say, integrate it into a report, provide it. We can do it, but of course it is going to delay some of these other things a bit.
I'm just saying that we need to have a substantive IP meeting. I'm not saying that let's put one together for show. Definitely we need to have a substantive meeting that result in critical information to move forward.
All right, you've got 100 days to do it. Do you want to identify the organizations?
I don't know who they are.
And you? Yeah. Do you want to identify them now?
I don't recall the name of the organization.
Okay,
but,
all right.
But two of them, so the leading
Do you know Mr. Marsteller?
Friends of Ethics has compiled a very robust list of probably 100 pages of the current leadership of every organization in the city.
Well, name a few of them.
Well, Common Cause League of Women Voters
Right.
come to mind, obviously, in this area, but it included every civic organization in the city.
Okay.
And there's 50 of them under the umbrella of the Coalition for San Francisco Neighborhoods, which is very supportive of the type of work we do. So I wanted to tell you, this is also on is it key drive? What do they call those things that you put in the computer?
Thumb drive?
Thumb drive. We provided that to the commission, a thumb drive with the paper document. So you have both of those, as we do, and you can communicate universally through that device using a standard spreadsheet. It was prepared by an attorney in our organization who was actually a techie as well. So I think I'm not a techie. I think this is eminently usable and
Thank you.
active.
Thank you. All right, call the roll, please.
I guess that's me. Commissioner Ambrose? Oh, what?
So is the motion to amend the policy prioritization plan?
Yes.
As you stated?
Commissioner Ambrose?
Yeah, I'm all in favor of developing this issue further, but I don't want to take the code of regulations off the to-do list, so I'm going to vote no.
Commissioner Ambrose votes no. Commissioner Rennie?
Aye.
Commissioner Rennie votes aye. Commissioner Kopp?
Aye.
Commissioner Kopp votes aye. And Commissioner Lee? No. 2-2 vote. 3 votes are required. No action.
But
Motion
I
fails.
do want to ask that we do start working to put together a meeting, and I don't know that whether you call it an interested parties meeting. I don't think inviting everybody in the world either would be my agenda. I think there are some apparently very complicated legal issues and strategy issues associated with proceeding with this. And while there's a lot of support for doing that, I need to have a better understanding of the strategy. So that's the meeting that I want to get organized, and I can do that on my own.
Let me just say, some months ago, I provided a legal memorandum prepared by the group to the staff, which lays out all the legislation and where it's pending in the United States.
Okay.
And areas where it's been approved. And the name of the organization. I'll resend all of that to all the commissioners and to.
Yeah, I would
staff,
appreciate that. I don't recall seeing it.
And the local two former city attorneys have been very much in the forefront of this. And I know they wouldn't be embarrassed if I identify them. One is Scott Embledge, and the other is Dennis Aftergut.
And I know them both and can follow up. Thank you.
But anyway, so.
Okay,
I'll
all
get
right.
that information.
Is there a motion to tell them what to proceed on here, tell them what to do on all these policy projects?
Commissioner Kopp, I might suggest that there, unless there is another change, I don't think the commission needs to take a vote.
All right, then
on
let's
the
go
plan
to
as
number 8, item 8. Enforcement report for the October, for this meeting. It's what, 4, 5, 6 pages? Has everybody read it? Anybody desire anything besides the 6 pages? Any public comment on it? If not, we have all read it, and we'll go to number 9, which is the Executive Director's report.
Thank you, Judge Kopp, Commissioner Kopp. As the memo notes, we welcomed a new temporary full-time member to the staff to help with our front counter duties during this busy election time and somewhat heated election as well. Connie Hosami has joined us from the elections department, and will be a terrific asset. Also, we did have progress on the 5 positions that were posted for applications. The window closed on September 21st. All of those positions as civil service positions are now in the exam phase, so that is proceeding as the city's processes allow. We also did finally move back into our office space this last week, and we hope to have all team members back on the same floor in another a couple of weeks. We're working with real estate to make that happen and finalize the last changes, but again, very much appreciated their leadership and their support of the Controller's office and allowing us the space during the temporary renovation of our offices. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Any questions? Any public comment? Mr. Marsteller?
I just wanted to extend my appreciation and awe at the work of the executive director on the robust approach she's taken to filling staff vacancies. I'm sure you've seen on the executive director's report the tremendous progress that she's made. It's extremely helpful to have a full complement, and we're very appreciative to the mayor and to the board for the funding of these positions and for the hard work of our executive director in making sure that these positions are funded and filled as quickly as possible. So I just wanted to thank her for her hard work.
Thank you, Mr. Marsteller. Next item is the pending, pardon me?
I just have a question. To the executive director, when do you expect the new person for the policy team to be hired and seated?
Excuse me. I think that all of these positions will not likely have a person in them until after the end of this calendar year. Hopefully, they will have people in chairs in January, but that is roughly the time frame that it takes with the city's hiring procedures.
All right, next item is pending investigations. Anybody want to go into a closed session on that as permitted by law?
No.
Huh? All right, hearing no such request, we pass to the next item, which is any new business to be presented.
Commissioner Commissioner Chu asked before she left if I would just notify you all again a calendaring question that we can follow up with you to poll. But the basic issue is to identify that the November meeting will be November 17th, Friday. The next scheduled meeting would be Friday, December the 21st. The question has come up, since that is the Friday before many people travel for the end of the year holidays, whether the commission wanted to look for another time to meet in December. We did an informal look. December 3rd on a Monday, I believe, is the only date that a televised room could be available in the morning if the commission wanted to move up its meeting, if December 21st at 2 did not work for you. And so that's one question for consideration. Of course, that has bearing on a number of things that are coming in the pipeline that we want to bring back to you. There'd be a quick turn from November, and we will poll you after this meeting.
How about Commissioner Chu? Is that acceptable to her, 21st?
I think she just wanted to raise the issue since the time.
Is it acceptable to her?
I do not know. I'll have to follow up with her as well.
Is it acceptable to the commissioners here?
I will not be here December 21st. I will not be here December 21st.
Well, all right, so three of us will be here. And do you know of any? All right, I don't know what you're going to do. She didn't tell you she could make it.
No, I will follow up with each of you next week
right.
to see if there are any issues of scheduling, and we can confirm that way.
Okay.
I'm available either of those dates, so.
All right. I want to ask you something under this, the rubric of this item. What is this mandamus action that this Mrs. Bason is referring to?
Sure. A couple weeks ago, Ms. Basson.
Basson.
B-A-S-S-A-N. Thank you, Chair Cobb. Ms. Basson filed a writ petition in Superior Court asking the Ethics Commission to consider her request to qualify for public financing as timely and to review it.
To request for what?
Her qualifying request for public financing.
All right.
So she did file this writ petition in Superior Court. Judge Kahn did rule in her favor. So the Ethics Commission.
What do you mean? An alternative writ or a peremptory?
1085 writ. Civil Code Procedure 1085.
Fast. All right, go ahead.
Yeah. So Judge Kahn did rule that the commission should consider her request to be timely and to review it. And I believe we're in the last few steps of completing that review. And one of my colleagues, Joshua White, who has been litigating this matter, will provide an update to the commission either later today or Monday.
Well, wait a minute. Your client lost. All right. Don't you come back to your client and ask your client whether the client wants to appeal?
So my colleague, Josh White, who's been handling litigation, has been in constant contact, or almost constant contact, I should say, with the Ethics Commission staff. And certainly if the commission wants to have a briefing on it, we can certainly have that discussion at a later time. But certainly we do want to provide an update to the commission as soon as we can.
When will that be? The election's November 5th.
I received an email immediately before the hearing. I'm assuming you're saying we're going to get an email. The decision just came down a few days ago. We're going to get an email describing why the judge ruled the way.
Exactly. And so these proceedings were not concluded in time to agendize the matter for discussion at today's meeting. It has been a very fast-moving matter. And as I mentioned, my colleague Josh White has
sent it to the commission. I request in writing a summary of what occurred, a summary of the petition, what it sought, How many pages on the petition, do you know?
I do not know off the top of my head.
All right, if it's,
But we can certainly send you a copy of the petition if that's what you want.
well, and I want a summary of what occurred after the petition was filed.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. Anything else under that? Any old business? I guess not. Any public comment? If not,
I'll move to adjourn.
motion to adjourn by Commissioner Rennie. Second?
I'll second that.
All right, all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? No. So we are adjourned.
Is that your